the dog no one could reach. Until a girl played her mother's melody. In the sanctuary's darkest pen sat a German shepherd. No one dared enter. His eyes were wild, his silence louder than any bark. Everyone thought he was beyond saving. Everyone except Mira. She didn't speak. She didn't train. She simply opened the cello case her mother left behind and played. What happened next made grown men cry. Not because the dog obeyed, but because, for the first time in years, he trusted. The room wasn't built for calm. Cement floors, fluorescent lighting, steel mesh barriers, and the constant, low-frequency hum of dogs barking anxious, aggressive, pleading, echoing off the walls like a warning no one cared to interpret. Argon stood frozen at the center of a mock urban drill site, his paws stiff on the concrete, nostrils flaring. His black and tan coat was soaked along the spine, not from exertion but from fear. A handler barked orders through a headset. Send him in. Breach left, targets behind the crate. But Argon didn't move. Instead, his ears pinned back, eyes dilated to slivers of dark moons. The sounds, compressed air, heavy boots, distant shouting layered over each other until they became unbearable. Then came the smoke pop, a standard part of the simulation. That was all it took. Argon snapped. Not at anyone, but at the air, at the pressure, at whatever storm inside him had been barely held back by sheer instinct. He lunged at the crate, not for the target, but in a blind frenzy. Teeth bared, tail tucked. A scream escaped him, not a bark, not a growl, but something raw, trapped between panic and pain. He spun in place, leaping away from his own shadow, slammed into the chain-link gate, scrambled backward like the world itself was caving in. "Control your dog!" a voice shouted. But the handler had already dropped the lead, backing away like Argon was a live wire sparking across the floor. Enough. The drill supervisor stepped forward, hand raised. Argon collapsed in a corner, chest heaving. Foam collected at the corners of his mouth. His body was still, but his eyes weren't. They darted left, right, up, never resting, looking for exits that didn't exist. In the control room above, behind a glass wall, a woman in uniform shook her head. "This is the third incident this quarter," she said. The man next to her, Commander Hale, rubbed a thumb along the edge of a thick manila file. Argon's file. History of over-responsiveness. Failed 4 confidence tests. Hyperreactive to stimuli. Aggression under stress. Multiple handlers cycled in and out. The woman sighed. And the bite? 2 months ago. No provocation. Civilian volunteer. Required 6 stitches. He flipped to the last page, took out a red stamp from his desk drawer. Thump. Untrainable. Transfer or euthanize, he said coldly. Below, Argon lay trembling on the floor. The drill was long over, but in his head, it hadn't stopped. A metal noise clanked, and he jumped, skidding on the slick surface. No one came near him now. No one dared. The handler returned only to drag the leash from the floor. He didn't make eye contact, didn't say a word. "He's not cut out for this," someone whispered from the corner. "He's broken," another replied. But they were wrong. Argon wasn't broken. He was overwhelmed, and no one had ever stopped long enough to ask why. He had been passed from one hand to another since he was 8 months old, each one expecting results, obedience, perfection. But Argon had something no one wanted to understand. Memory. Of raised voices. Of confinement. Of commands delivered without trust, only force. The truth no file could record was this. Argon wasn't disobedient, he was terrified. Every noise was a threat, every hand a potential blow. And in a world of blunt force and clipped commands, no one had taught him how to trust, only how to react. That night, the file landed on the cold metal desk in a different wing of the facility, a lower-level processing room where rejected K-9S went before their fate was decided. A bored clerk opened it, stared at the word stamped in red. Untrainable. A number was written in pencil below. An internal code, it meant. Hold for transfer 7 days. Then terminate if no takers. Argon sat in the back of his crate, knees tucked, chest to metal, eyes still wide. His muscles twitched in his sleep. If he ever did sleep, a camera in the corner of the room blinked red. No one was watching it. And still, in that hollow quiet, Argon lifted his head when a janitor passed. For a moment, there was a glimmer, the smallest one of hope in his eyes. But the man kept walking. The snow had not let up for hours. It glazed the narrow mountain roads like a veil of silence, softening the world to a hush, but inside the reinforced transport van, there was no peace. Only a stillness that vibrated with tension. Argon lay curled in the farthest corner of the steel-floored cage, his back pressed tight against the cold wall, as if trying to become invisible. His eyes, those storm-hardened amber eyes, were wide open. Not alert, not asleep, just waiting for something to go wrong. Again. The van's interior rattled slightly as it made another cautious turn down a winding, snow-cloaked path. At the wheel, an older man shifted in his seat and muttered under his breath. His name tag read, D. Murphy, Gov. Gdevet Transport Division. He glanced once in the rearview mirror, not at the road, but at the thick steel mesh that separated him from the creature behind it. Still not moving, Murphy mumbled, reaching for the thin beige file folder resting on the passenger seat beside his thermos. He gave it a tap to flatten the corner and flipped it open. The first line was stamped in red. Untrainable. Class D. Transfer to VHS for final evaluation or euthanasia. He exhaled, long and low, fogging up the window. The windshield wipers whispered back and forth like a tired heartbeat. Name Argon, he read aloud. Breed, German Shepherd. Born in classified breeding program Alpha Line stock. Assigned to 3 units. Rejected by all 3. Murphy shook his head slowly. Jesus. He kept reading, the road curving gently around a line of barren trees, their limbs like fingers reaching for some distant, long-gone spring. Incident Log 1. Age 1.8. Overreactive during crate training. Broke handler's wrist. Declared highly sensitive to restraint and voice command. Murphy whistled through his teeth. Poor bastard, he muttered, stealing another glance in the mirror. Argon hadn't moved. His ribs rose and fell, slow, shallow. His ears were half tilted back, neither alert nor relaxed, just bracing. Murphy flipped another page. Incident Log 3. Age 2.3. Bit civilian during airfield noise drill. Panic. Induced. Transferred to Blackwell Tactical. He paused. His eyes lingered on the next line, his voice dropping. Blackwell handler notes, dog entered state of tonic immobility after simulated gunfire. Pupils dilated. Tail tucked. Saliva frothing. Seizure suspected. Trainer recommended behavioral euthanasia. Murphy put the file down for a moment, staring at the falling snow ahead. His knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. Why do they always want to fix what they don't try to understand? He whispered. Behind him, the van creaked slightly with the shifting weight of its only passenger. Murphy instinctively looked in the mirror again, but Argon hadn't stirred, just his eyes. They were now watching him through the small mesh opening. Unblinking, hollow. Murphy swallowed. He picked up the last page of the file. Final transfer order. Valley Hayes Sanctuary. Previously under L. Rourke, deceased. Now supervised by Rhea Rourke, age 19. Authorization signed under Emotional Rehabilitation Clause. Murphy leaned back, lips pursed. You're going to a girl, huh? He said softly, as if talking to the snow. No more drills, no more screaming men with clipboards. Just a kid with too much to live up to. He looked up, locking eyes with Argon in the rearview again. The shepherd didn't blink. You any good with music? Murphy asked, half smiling. 'Cause I heard she plays cello. The snow thickened, spiraling in delicate currents past the van's headlights. They were halfway up the northern ridge now where signals dropped and the sky opened wider. Murphy sighed and reached down for his thermos. He didn't notice how Argon's ears twitched at the sound of the cap unscrewing. Didn't see how, just briefly, the dog's body flinched as if expecting the smell of anesthetic or the hiss of a syringe. He just kept talking, maybe to ease his own thoughts more than anything else. I've seen a few like you, Murphy said, voice low. They breakfast, and they break deep. Not 'cause they're weak. 'Cause they feel everything. Every damn thing. He swallowed. And no one ever stays long enough to help them make sense of it. Another sharp turn. A hill. The tires crunched over frozen gravel. Murphy adjusted his jacket as the cold seeped through the cracks of the cabin. He cleared his throat. "I heard what happened at Fort Laramie," he said quietly, almost reluctantly. "Didn't put it in the file. Guess it was too classified. But I know. He didn't say more. Didn't have to." Behind him, the silence stretched. Argonne remained still, but his eyes shifted just slightly toward the floor, as if something in that name stirred a shadow, a memory. They drove the rest of the way without speaking. When the van finally crested the last snowy rise, a wooden sign came into view, half covered in frost, its letters carved and weathered. "Valley Haze Sanctuary. Trust begins in the quiet." Murphy parked, cutting the engine. The sudden absence of the motor made the world feel painfully loud. Wind buffeted the frame. Somewhere in the distance, a cello note sang through the hills faint, uncertain, like it had been waiting for something to return. Murphy stood, file in hand, and walked to the rear. He paused before opening the gate. "You may not know it, kid," he whispered, more to the metal than to the dog. "But this is your last shot." He unlocked the cage. Argonne didn't move. But for the first time since the transfer began, he blinked. The snow had quieted everything. Outside, the trees stood like statues wrapped in frost, and the wind whispered through the bare limbs with a kind of mourning. Inside the old wooden house at the edge of Valley Haze Sanctuary, Mira Devane sat cross-legged on the attic floor, surrounded by boxes she hadn't touched since the funeral. Dust floated like pale ghosts in the soft winter light. Her fingers trembled as she opened the old recorder her mother's. The casing was scratched, worn at the edges, just like everything else in the sanctuary that still bore her mother's fingerprints. She pressed play. "Mira, if you're listening to this, it means I'm gone. But the dogs are still there. The land is still breathing. And so are you. You're enough, Mira. Even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts." The voice cracked on that last word, hurts, like it knew something she didn't. Mira closed her eyes. It had been 7 weeks since the accident, since the night the old blue truck slid on black ice and her mother never came home. 7 weeks since Mira buried, the only person who ever made her feel seen. She had always been the quiet one, the girl who played cello instead of speaking, who felt safer among animals than people. But her mother understood. She didn't demand words. Now it was just Mira and the silence. A knock echoed from downstairs, 3 hard raps, one soft. Hank, the old caretaker, was back. Mira rose slowly, pressing the recorder to her chest for one last moment before slipping it into her pocket. When she opened the door, Hank was there, cheeks red from the cold, a clipboard tucked under his arm. "You should put on a coat, kid," he grumbled. "There's someone you need to meet." Mira followed him across the snow-dusted trail to the far barn. The same path she used to walk holding her mother's hand. That barn had once been used for birthing litters, then later for rehab, cases the dangerous ones, the unfixables. Hank unlocked the side door and pushed it open. The heat lamp inside cast a low amber glow. A crate sat in the center of the barn, reinforced with steel mesh, chains, and a lock that looked like it belonged to a prison. "He came in an hour ago," Hank said, flipping through papers. "Name's Argonne, German Shepherd, 3 years old. Previously in government tactical K9 training. Failed out of 6 programs. Bit 2 handlers. Destroyed a training wing during a stress test. Latest file marked him as untrainable," Mira said quietly, finishing his sentence. She looked toward the crate. It was quiet inside. No growling, no barking. Just a slow, rhythmic, sound-like breathing that hadn't decided if it would stay. "Most folks would have him put down," Hank muttered. "But your mama had a soft spot for the broken ones." Mira stepped forward. The floor creaked beneath her boots. Inside the crate, Argonne was curled tightly into himself, eyes half-lidded, body motionless except for the shiver in his ribs. Not fear, something deeper, something fractured. His fur was dull, with small patches where stress had caused him to gnaw at his own skin. His ears were twitching, not alert, but reacting like he was bracing for a world that never stopped screaming. Mira didn't speak. She didn't say, "Good boy," or "It's okay," or any of the 1,000 things people thought dogs needed to hear. Instead, she sat right there, on the cold barn floor, 5 feet from his cage. Mira sat cross-legged. pulled her scarf tighter around her, and closed her eyes. Hank stared. "You sure you want to do this?" Mira nodded once. "I don't think he needs another voice. What do you mean?" She opened her eyes again, soft but steady. "Everyone's tried telling him what to do. Has anyone tried just being still with him?" Hank didn't answer, but for the first time in a long while, he looked at Mira not as a girl playing grown-up, but as someone who had inherited more than a sanctuary. She had inherited her mother's way of listening. That night, she didn't go back to the house. She stayed in the barn, wrapped in a blanket, leaning against the post, her cello case beside her like a trusted friend. She didn't open it, not yet. That would come later. For now, all that mattered was not moving too fast. Across the barn, Argon's eyes opened in the dark. He did not snarl, he did not lunge. But he did not sleep either. Something in the room had changed. The storm had passed, but the clouds didn't leave. They just sat there, low and gray over the Valley Haze sanctuary, like a grief that refused to move on. Snow clung to the window panes in breath-like patterns, and inside the training lodge, the air still smelled faintly of her mother lavender, old leather, and cedar dust, from cello strings too long untouched. Mira sat cross-legged on the wooden floor of the study, surrounded by cardboard boxes stamped with her mother's name. Claire Devane, Director, 1994, 2024. Most of them hadn't been opened since the funeral. She hadn't dared. Until now. Until the dog. She reached for the worn, black spiral notebook that had been resting on top of the pile. A piece of cello rosin crumbled beside it, brittle with time. The front cover was cracked, dog-eared, the ink smudged from years of fingers thumbing through it in the rain, in the field, in the quiet between storms. Mira opened it slowly. Inside were pages of diagrams, behavioral charts, scent tracking routines, journal entries full of tight, meticulous handwriting. Page after page of canine assessments, notes in blue ink. Kip responds best to auditory commands, but spooks at deep male voices. Nova shuts down under restraintry, positive reinforcement only. Keep sessions under 15 minutes. Watch for tail flick, early sign of escalation. It was her mother in pieces, in thoughts, in care. Mira blinked back the tight sting behind her eyes. She turned another page and stopped. There it was. A single line written in her mother's rushed, almost slanted script. It had no context, no chart. Some dogs don't respond to control. They respond to music. Mira's breath caught. She stared at the sentence, letting it sink into the silence. The room seemed to exhale with her. And just like that, she could see her mother again kneeling in the soft mud behind the old stables, speaking not with words, but with the slow pull of her breath, her calm hands, her patience. Music wasn't just sound, she used to say. It was presence. It was being. She closed the notebook gently and held it against her chest. Down the hall, the cello waited in the old studio. She hadn't touched it since the night after the accident, since the sanctuary's phone had rung and a stranger's voice had fractured her life into before and after. But now, there was a whisper of something else. Not a command, not even a choice, a memory. She stood slowly and walked barefoot across the creaking hallway, her fingers trembling as they turned the rusted knob to the music room. The cello stood in the corner, its wooden body dulled by dust, the bow leaning beside it like a soldier long forgotten. Mira knelt. She ran a hand over the curves of the instrument, her skin tingling at the contact. The scent of varnish, faint but familiar, hit her chest like a wave. Her mother's ghost seemed to linger in the corners of the room, the rug still slightly curled at the edge, in the mismatched chair cushions, in the pages of sheet music still tucked under a broken metronome. She sat. Her fingers curled around the neck of the cello, lifted the bow. She hadn't played in weeks, maybe months. Time had twisted since Claire died, become slippery, untrustworthy. She pressed the cello to her body, settled the bow on the string. Inhale. The first note was fragile, almost not there, more memory than sound. It quivered in the room like a question. Her hand faltered. The bow stuttered. Her shoulders tensed. And just like that, the weight of the grief returned, an ache in the throat, a hollowness behind the ribs. Her vision blurred. She stopped, lowered the bow. Silence returned, thick as snowfall. She let the cello lean back against her chest, her eyes closed. And in that moment, not even trying to play, she felt something shift not in the music, but in herself. She could hear her mother's voice again, not the final voicemail, not the last message saved on her phone, but her real voice. The one that hummed to the dogs while brushing their fur, the one that sang out of key while washing breakfast bowls. The voice that had told her, "You don't always need to be strong. Sometimes it's enough to be still." Mira wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater. The cello still hummed faintly in her chest. Down the path, across the snowy yard, a figure sat in isolation argon, locked in the perimeter run, unmoving since he arrived. Not a bark, not a growl. Just those eyes, always alert, tense, unreadable. Some dogs don't respond to control. She stood, cello still cradled in her arms. Her mother had trained over 100 dogs, but she had always said, "It's never about obedience. It's about understanding who they are without fear." And Mira wasn't her mother. But maybe, just maybe, that wasn't the point. The world narrowed to a rectangle of rusted steel mesh and cold stone floors. Inside that cage, the air was soaked with the bitter stench of bleach and fear. The scent clung to Argon's nostrils, mingling with the fading trails of other dogs that had come and gone before him, most screaming, few silent, none returned. His body was coiled in the corner, every tendon pulled taut beneath the surface of his brindled fur, ears pinned back, eyes wide, darting. The click of a boot outside sent a tremor through his limbs. His tail mangled from an old door slant-twitched, but made no noise. Then, silence. That was worse. In the stillness, memories flooded in like floodwater through a breached levee. The simulation chamber, the smoke, the voice shouting orders, the air pressure dropping, and the muzzle tight, punishing, cold. He had screamed inside, a scream only he could hear, while the humans wrote notes and marked failure across his file. The door latch turned. Argon didn't lift his head. He didn't need to. He could feel the presence, the warmth of something. Not threatening, but unfamiliar. Not military boots, not the brisk clip of authority. This was different, lighter, softer, but still a presence. The door creaked open. Slow, not forceful. No sharp commands. No shouting. No catch-pull. Just breath. A girl knelt outside the cage. Argon's eyes flicked up. Just slightly. She didn't speak. Not at first. She didn't reach through the bars like others did. She didn't hold treats or flash keys or toss a rope to tempt him. She just knelt. A soft wind moved through the sanctuary corridor. Outside, snow whispered against the windows. Inside, she watched him. Argon could hear her heart beat slower than the others. Steady, unafraid. Not completely calm, but not recoiling either. Her scent wasn't like the others. There was no bitterness of adrenaline, no trace of synthetic soap or antiseptic, just something floral, subtle, and grief. He could smell that too, though he didn't know the word for it. She tilted her head slightly. Not to challenge, as to see. His muscles quivered under his fur. The impulse was clear. Lunge, defend, show teeth, make her leave. But something in her posture held him. Then she moved, just slightly. A shift in her knee as she adjusted her balance, so slow, so measured, but to Argon, it was a spike of lightning. He bolted upright, claws skidding against the concrete, and slammed himself into the back of the cage, eyes wide, hackles up. A snarl choked in his throat but never came out. He froze, trembling. The girl didn't retreat. She didn't flinch. She simply lowered her gaze. Not in fear, in respect. Argon's breath hitched. His chest moved up and down, too fast. His ribs showed beneath the fur. A map of every week without trust. His ears tilted, unsure. Still, she said nothing. Seconds stretched. Then, barely audible, like a thought spoken aloud, she whispered, "Okay, just that." Then she rose not abruptly, but like smoke quiet. careful, keeping her face turned slightly so he wouldn't feel trapped. She walked away, her steps fading down the corridor. Argon stayed frozen, his body still ready, still anticipating pain. But no pain came. No collar, no order, no consequence. Just the scent she left behind, warmth and loss. His tail shifted, barely. A twitch, then nothing. The room was small, quiet. A narrow window allowed a sliver of snowlight to fall across the linoleum floor, casting long, pale reflections that trembled with every flicker of the monitor. Mira sat alone. The video archive unit hummed faintly, a subtle pulse beneath the silence. Her fingers hovered for a moment before pressing play. The screen lit up with grainy footage time stamps, blinking in military format, file names that read more like warnings than documentation. Subject: Argon. Session number: 03. Trainer: Martinez. Status: incomplete. The camera angle was static, cold. The first frame showed a man-thick-armed, firm voice standing outside Argon's cage. The dog was muzzled. Not gently, but with industrial-grade restraint, the kind used for animals labeled too far gone. His eyes wild, corner-darted from wall to wall. The trainer barked orders, loud, too fast, a whip crack of syllables designed to dominate. Argon didn't respond. He couldn't, not when his breathing was restricted, not when sedation made his paws drag and his legs tremble. The trainer snapped his fingers near Argon's face, then hit the bars. Hard. The screen buzzed. Mira flinched. Argon recoiled on-screen, spine curved like a bow, claws skittering as he threw himself back into the far wall. The video paused itself as the connection buffered. Mira exhaled. The breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, fogging the edge of the screen. She reached out and pressed forward. Session number 07. Trainer: D. Sampson. Protocol: Level 2. Outcome: unsafe. In this clip, Argon wore a harness rigged with an e-collar. His tail was already tucked. A man with gloves and a clipboard paced in front of the cage, reciting from a training manual. The door opened. Argon was pulled out by leash, forced into a sit. The first jolt came when he refused a command. The second, when he whimpered. By the third, he dropped to the floor, motionless. Not submissivus. Gone. Checked out. A hollow shell. Mira's throat tightened. She skipped ahead. Session number 12. Compliance attempt. 11 minutes. Outcome: terminated. This one was worse. There was no leash, no contact, only a camera mounted high, watching from a corner. Inside the enclosure, a man tossed a toy, then a piece of meat, then a loud metal pan. Argon didn't move. He stared at the wall. Even when the trainer cursed and walked away, Argon's eyes remained locked on nothing, as if the room itself was safer than looking into another pair of human eyes. Mira stopped the footage. The monitor went black. The silence afterward was heavy. Not empty, but weighted, like the pause between thunderclaps. She leaned back in the chair, staring at her own reflection in the dark screen. Pale face, tired eyes. That same quiet determination she'd carried since the day she first walked into the sanctuary and saw his file. Unadoptable, unstable, unresponsive. No one had asked why he was like that. They'd only asked how to fix him, how to break him open like a stubborn lock. Mira stood slowly, crossed the room. She looked out the window at the yard beyond, white with snow, untouched except for the faint paw prints near Argon's run. He hadn't come out fully, only peeked, only watched. She whispered it before she even realized she was speaking. "We're not doing this your way." The words hovered in the air like breath in the cold. Not defiant, just certain. Not louder than the silence, just clearer. Her hand reached toward the light switch. The room went dark, and somewhere down the hall, the sound of claws tapping softly on concrete echoed. Scene 3,1. First notes. The snow had begun to fall again, soft and listless, like the air itself was grieving. Out past the main barn, tucked near the outer fencing of Valley Hayes Sanctuary, sat the enclosure that held the dog nobody wanted to touch. The world around it was white and hushed, as if the earth had agreed in silence that this space required reverence. Mira stood at the gate, cello case in hand. She hesitated, not from fear, but from something deeper respect maybe, or the weight of not knowing what would happen next. She had spent nights combing through her mother's old journals, tracing ink with the pads of her fingers like one might read Braille, hoping some part of Claire Devaine's instinct could pass through her skin and into her bones. And again, she'd come back to that one line. Some dogs don't respond to control. They respond to music. In seconds. Mira didn't know what it meant yet, but it had stayed with her like a chord that wouldn't resolve. She unlatched the cello case with careful fingers. The sound click was sharp in the winter air. Argon's enclosure stirred. Through the chain link in the shadows, Mira saw movement, a glint of amber, low and guarded. He was already watching her. She didn't speak, didn't even fully lift her gaze. Instead, she took 3 slow steps toward the wooden bench outside the enclosure, knelt beside it, and gently lifted the cello from its velvet nest. It was heavier than she remembered. Or maybe she was just tired in a new kind of way. The bow was cold in her hand. She sat. No one had played here since the funeral. The cello hadn't made a sound since Claire's hands had last drawn life from it, and now Mira wasn't sure if it even could anymore. But she positioned it against her chest, adjusted her footing in the packed snow, and closed her eyes. There was no audience, just the wind and Argon. The first note was almost nothing, a tremble of sound, more breath than music. It hovered in the cold like fog off a lake, unformed and unafraid. Argon didn't move. Mira's bow hand shook a little, but she didn't stop. She coaxed out another note, then another. A simple progression, minor key. Something her mother used to hum in the kitchen on long, rainy mornings. She let it wander. The air drank it in. Inside the enclosure, Argon's muscles stayed coiled. He began to pace a knot frantically, but with purpose, as if the sound made him uneasy, unsure whether it was threat or memory. Mira didn't look up. She didn't try to calm him. That wasn't the point. She just played. And the music soft, uncertain and alive wrapped around the space between them. There was something sacred in the way it filled the void, not an intrusion, but a presence. It didn't demand Argon's attention, didn't command obedience or offer reward. It was just there, like breath, or grief, or time. He stopped pacing. His ears twitched toward the sound. Even as his body turned away, he circled once, then again. Then slowly, he curled up in the farthest corner, back to her, as if he couldn't decide whether the music meant danger or mourning. Mira kept playing. The bow drew out long, aching phrases. Notes bent and swelled, trembled and rested. She didn't know what she was. Composing it wasn't a song so much as a conversation without words. Her fingers remembered shapes her mind didn't name. And still, Argon did not come closer. But he didn't lash out, didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't dig. He simply listened, in his own way. And that, Mira thought, might be the start of something. The cold bit at her knuckles. Her fingers were stiff now, and the cello's wooden back was damp from her breath. But she didn't stop until the melody had run its course, until the final note thinned into the air like smoke, leaving only silence behind. Mira let the bow drop gently to her side. Exhaled. She glanced up. Argon was still curled tight, tail over nose, but his breathing had slowed. His ears were no longer pinned flat. One twitched, as if still catching the echo of something that didn't belong to the world of shouting and leashes and cages. She whispered into the cold, just loud enough for herself. Okay. It wasn't victory, wasn't progress, not in the way most would measure it, but it wasn't failure either. It was presence. She stood, hands stiff from the cold cello, heavy in her arms once more. She latched the case without sound, brushed snow off her coat, and looked back one last time before walking away. Argon didn't look at her, but he didn't stop listening. The frost had not yet lifted when Mira sat down again, her cello cradled between knees wrapped in wool. Third morning. Same spot, same air, cold enough to bite at her fingertips through the gloves she refused to remove. Sound was truer when her skin could feel the strings. She didn't look toward the enclosure at first. That was part of the quiet agreement. Argon didn't pace today, not at first. He stood, watched, then turned his head the moment she drew the bow across the strings and sank into a low, velvet-rich G. It wasn't a song yet, only a hum, a breath through wood and wire. Notes half-formed like thoughts that didn't ask to be finished. And then just as her eyes met the morning's gray edges, saw it. A flick, a subtle tilt of one torn ear toward her. Not fully, not even confidently, but enough. She held the note too long. The vibrato wavered slightly from the tremble she hadn't expected in her arms. Her breath caught. There was no camera, no clipboard, no sedative, just her and him and the space between them that had not yet learned to trust. She didn't smile. That would break it. Instead, she dipped her chin slightly, almost like a bow to his silence, and kept playing. Low notes, no sudden changes, no crescendos. Her mother used to say that music was not the absence of silence, but the thread that wove through it like veins through a leaf. Mira wondered if Argon heard the thread, or if he only felt the stillness when it was not tangled with pain. After 10 minutes, she stopped. Not abruptly, she let the last note trail like breath on glass. Then, setting the cello gently beside her, she whispered almost to herself, "I saw you." Argon had already turned away. His back was to her. But the ear hadn't returned fully to rest. It hovered half alert, half unwilling to let go of something it didn't understand. She didn't press it, didn't call, didn't even get up right away. Mira simply sat there as the cold worked its way into her joints, her lungs. This was the kind of patience her mother had once spoken about, the kind that required you to ask for nothing, only to be present. That night, back inside the sanctuary's main building, Mira found herself tugged toward the storage loft where her mother's old things were still packed in careful layers of dust and linen. She was searching for something, not a physical object, but a thread in her own memory. She found it in the shape of a broken umbrella. It wasn't the umbrella that mattered, but what it held nestled between the ribs was a drawing, childlike, done in crayon, a cello, crooked and far too large, and underneath it the scrawl, "Safe place." Mira pressed it to her chest, eyes closing. The memory bloomed. A thunderstorm. She must have been 6, maybe 7. Lightning had split the dark wide open, and she'd crawled under the belly of her mother's cello, tucked between her knees as Claire played not loudly, not to impress, just to anchor. Each stroke of the bow had overridden the thunder in Mira's ears. She remembered that more clearly than the storm. The way the wood hummed against her ribs, the way her mother didn't speak, only played. That kind of presence was deeper than words. Back in the present, Mira sat at the old kitchen table with a worn journal. She turned to the last few pages. They were different. Not about dogs. About fear. About storms. And music. One line stood alone, underlined twice in faded ink. Some animals don't need control. They need resonance. She copied it onto her own page, her breath catching. The next morning, she returned to Argon's enclosure. Same place, same routine. But this time, when she began to play, she chose a piece her mother used to hum. Not complex, a lullaby, really. The kind that settled into your chest and stayed there long after the music stopped. Halfway through, as the notes swayed like candlelight through the cold, Argon lifted his head not fully, but just enough to mark the sound again. And the ear tilted, farther this time. Like something inside him was not sure whether to resist or remember. Mira didn't stop. Her bow glided through the breath of winter, through everything unsaid. And in that quiet, the dog did not flee, did not flinch. He simply listened. Or perhaps more honestly, he allowed the music to exist in his world for 1 minute longer. Mira whispered again. When the last note slipped into the stillness, "Thank you. Not for trust, not yet, but for the tilt of an ear, for a thread woven quietly between two broken things." The morning mist clung low to the ground, curling around the gravel paths like something alive and unwilling to let go. From the far side of the sanctuary, the faint resonance of a cello still shimmered in the air. No melody now, just the echo of something that had once been tender. Mira sat cross-legged on the dew-damp bench beside Argon's enclosure, her fingers resting on the neck of the cello in her lap. She wasn't playing. Not this time. Just existing, holding space. That had become her rhythm. Lately measured silences, small acknowledgments, and listening deeper than most would bother. Argon wasn't at the front of the enclosure today. He had settled in the farthest corner, half shadowed by the slats of the fence and morning light. But he wasn't growling. And more importantly, he wasn't hiding his eyes anymore. That mattered. She was still scribbling into her mother's old notebook when she heard boots crunch behind her. The kind of stride that didn't ask for permission. The kind that was used to being obeyed. "Devane," came a clipped voice. Mira didn't turn immediately. She knew that voice. Rob Lansing, senior trainer, ex-military. His hands knew discipline like others knew music. She closed the notebook slowly, marking her place with the tip of the pencil. Then she rose. "Morning, Rob," she said gently. He didn't respond with courtesy. His face was stern, jaw set, as if every soft thing in the world offended him just by existing. His arms crossed as he looked from Mira to the enclosure, where Argon remained curled, unmoving. "You've been at this 3 weeks," Rob said. "No leash, no commands, no barrier work. Just concertos." Mira exhaled through her nose. "Calm. Always calm. I'm observing. Documenting triggers, stimuli, trust indicators. Rob's mouth curled like he tasted something sour. "He's not a therapy dog, Mira. He's a military-grade K9 asset gone feral. You think you can balk the trauma out of him?" She looked down at her boots, the laces soaked with morning dew, then slowly up again. Her voice was soft, but there was no apology in it. "He flinched when someone snapped a pen cap yesterday, but he didn't growl," she said. 2 weeks ago, he would have lunged at the fence." Rob huffed. "And that's your metric for progress?" She nodded. "Yes." For a long moment, the silence held between them like a taut string. Then Rob stepped closer, voice low but tight with control.
"You know what happens if this fails? If he snaps? He doesn't get a retirement plan, Mira. He gets a needle."
Her breath hitched, almost imperceptibly. But she held her ground. "That's why we're not doing it your way," she said, "because your way already failed." A beat passed. Rob's eyes darkened. "You have no credentials. You're not certified in behavioral conditioning, let alone in post-combat K9 rehab." "No," Mira said. "I'm not. But I grew up around dogs no one wanted. Dogs that bit, dogs that trembled when doors slammed. And my mother, she taught them they didn't have to earn stillness. They could just be." She glanced over her shoulder at the enclosure, where Argon's ears twitched slightly at the sound of her voice. "He's not broken," she whispered. "He's just waiting for someone to not give up on him." Rob exhaled sharply, as if trying to suppress something between pity and irritation. "You've got heart, kid, but heart doesn't keep people safe." She met his gaze. "Neither does fear." His jaw worked. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Mira stood there long after his footsteps faded into gravel and wind. That night, she stayed later than usual. The staff lounge was quiet. Most had gone home or were pretending not to notice her in the corner with her mother's journal spread open, pages soft from years and a dozen different kinds of weather. She ran her fingers over one passage, the ink slightly smudged by time or tears, maybe both. "Some dogs don't trust silence. It feels like the breath before pain. But music is a language that doesn't expect obedience." Mira closed her eyes. The cello leaned beside her like an old friend scratched, dulled, but warm where it mattered. She carried it back outside beneath the stars. Argon was awake. He always was. She didn't play. She just sat down near the fence and said softly, "You don't have to come closer. I just thought we'd both like the quiet tonight." The wind rustled dry leaves somewhere in the brush. Argon didn't move, but his eyes found her through the shadows. There was no growl, just breathing, just presence. For now, that was enough. The wind slipped through the pine trees like a breath not meant to be heard. It carried with it the faintest bite of winter, cold enough that Mira had wrapped her scarf twice, tucking the ends into the collar of her mother's worn canvas jacket. The cello case lay open on the bench beside her. She held the instrument like something sacred, her fingers settling against the strings as if greeting an old friend. The enclosure ahead stretched wide, sparse, save for the worn patches of grass and a few concrete slabs. And in the far corner where shadow met wire fencing was Argon. He hadn't moved since she arrived. Chest low, chin on paws, body like a taut coil. Not asleep, but not quite awake either. Watching without watching. Existing in a space just beyond reach. Mira closed her eyes. Then, Almost reverently, she began to play. It was her mother's lullaby, soft, slow, shaped by memory rather than notation. The kind of melody that didn't demand attention but offered it like a hand outstretched. The first few notes trembled in the air before steadying, flowing out into the cold morning like ribbons of warmth against the frost. The bow glided. Vibrations ran through the cello's body, up her spine, into her throat. The world blurred at the edges. Argon didn't steer, but he didn't flinch either. Mira didn't expect a miracle. She just needed him to listen. The melody lingered fragile, almost translucent. It hummed against the steel bars, echoed between the walls of the enclosure. A sound not of command, not of control, but of invitation. Halfway through the third measure, something shifted. A scrape, a shuffle. Barely audible, but Mira's bow paused, hovering. She looked up. Argon had stood. He didn't run, didn't bolt to the farthest edge like he had so many times before. Instead, with the cautious uncertainty of a creature that has only known consequences for movement, he took a step, then another, and another. Each paw seemed to hesitate mid-air, waiting for some punishment that never came. Mira didn't breathe. She didn't dare. Her fingers trembled, the bow sagging slightly as her eyes followed his approach. He crossed half the enclosure before he stopped. 10 feet. Maybe 12. It might as well have been a mile, but to Mira, it was the closest he had ever been. He didn't growl. He didn't pace. He just stood there, legs braced as if against some invisible wind, ears forward but not pinned, breath visible in soft clouds. And he looked at her, not through her, not past her, at her. Mira's chest constricted. She wasn't sure what surprised her more, that he hadn't turned away, or that his gaze held no trace of panic, no fire, just a searching stillness. Like he didn't understand why the noise in the air didn't hurt, why her hands didn't move like the others. She swallowed hard, tears slipping down without permission. No sound escaped her lips, just the creak of wood as she shifted on the bench, adjusting her bow again, lifting the cello back into position. She played the next line like a whisper to the cold, a slow descending phrase, barely louder than the wind. Argon didn't move, but he didn't retreat. That was enough. She finished the lullaby in pieces, each note delicate as though stitched by memory and grief. When the last phrase lingered and faded into the gray of the morning, she let the silence settle. It didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Argon blinked, slowly. Then, with the same deliberate caution, he lay downright where he was, not tucked in the shadows, not curled against the back corner, still watching, still breathing, still there. Mira lowered her cello and exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Her hands, stiff with cold intention, finally released the bow. She set it gently in her lap, like placing flowers at a grave. She didn't speak, didn't need to. In her notebook tucked beneath the cello's velvet lining, she would later write in tiny, slanted script, Day 11, he crossed halfway. No signs of distress. First eye contact. No retreat. Breathing slow. Watching. Stayed through the lullaby. Claire's music reached him. The wind picked up slightly, stirring loose pine needles along the fence. Argon's ears twitched at the sound, but he didn't look away. Mira nodded once, quietly. I see you, she whispered, and for the first time, she believed maybe he saw her too. The scarf was an afterthought, or maybe it wasn't. Mira stood outside the enclosure that morning, fingers buried deep in the pockets of her coat, breath soft in the frozen dawn. The cello hadn't come with her today, only silence and the pulse of something quieter than musica, kind of hope so fragile it could disappear with a single bark, a single flinch. She pulled the scarf from her coat pocket. It was wool, a deep forest green, worn at the edges. Her mother's. It still smelled faintly of cello rosin, lavender soap, and something that reminded her of winter mornings before the world broke. She didn't say a word as she stepped forward, just undid the loop around her neck and, with slow, visible motion, knelt and placed the scarf just inside the gate. The metal lock clicked softly behind her as she retreated. Argon had been watching from the shadows near the rear wall. He didn't move. She didn't expect him to. The hours passed slowly. Morning light slid into the noon haze, and the yard lay still but for the drifting of dead pine needles and the occasional restless shift of a weighty paw against gravel. Mira sat by the observation window, fingers loosely laced, eyes never quite leaving the scarf. Eventually, Argon moved. Not rushed, not hesitant either. A slow, deliberate prowl more wolf than dog. He stopped a meter away from the scarf, sniffed the air once, twice, his ears swiveled, no humans in reach, no voices, no force. He inched forward, not to tear, not to dominate, just to understand. The tip of his nose brushed the fabric, and he didn't recoil. That night, Mira couldn't sleep. She sat at her desk in the dim blue light of the observation terminal, sipping cold tea, eyes fixed on the grainy grayscale image of Argon's enclosure. It was past 1 a.m. there, in the corner of the pen where he usually curled into himself like something broken and braced for violence. The shape was different tonight. Argon was curled around something. The scarf. He had not shredded it. He had not ignored it. He had pulled it close and rested his great scarred head atop it like a memory he was too tired to fight anymore. Mira leaned forward until her forehead touched the edge of the monitor. She exhaled, deep, shaky, reverent. It wasn't touch, but it was trust. And in her world, that meant more. 2 days later, a technician named Owen mentioned the footage offhandedly in the staff lounge, chewing on a protein bar with too much bravado. "Did you see what the freak did with that rag? Curled up like a baby with a blankie. Guess the girl's making him soft." A laugh followed. Another trainer, Robinson, added, "Or maybe he's just plotting when to lunge again. You forget what he did to Gregor's arm?" Mira said nothing. She stirred her tea, gaze on the swirling steam. They hadn't seen it. Not truly. Not the way he had exhaled. The way his body, usually taut as a live wire, had eased into the shape of rest, not submission. The difference was everything. That night, she sat with the scarf's twinner Onend, folded it in her lap as the cello rested beside her knees. She didn't play. She just breathed. The next morning, the pen was dusted with a thin veil of frost. Mira walked past the staff gate, stopped by the fence. Argon was awake watching her, not from the farthest shadows this time, but from the middle ground, closer than he'd ever stood willingly. The scarf was beneath one paw, not guarded, not clenched, just there, like something that belonged. Mira lowered herself to a squat. She didn't speak. The silence was enough. In that space, between the cold air, the wool threads, and the quiet acknowledgement of one soul recognizing another's unwilling surrender, something wordless passed between them. Not obedience, not progress. Something older, something real. And in that still, morning light, Mira realized she was no longer trying to fix a broken thing. She was being invited to witness the first crack in the shell that held him. And through it, the breath of life came leaking back in. The latch clicks like a breath held too long. It's just past 6 in the morning. Stillness clings to the facility like a second skin. Outside, frost paints the edges of the chain-link enclosure in pale silver. Mira's hands shake not from the cold, but from the weight of this moment. For the first time, the gate to Argon's world will open. He waits at the far end, still as stone. Only his breath moves, forming soft ghosts in the chilled air. His ears flick once at the sound of Mira's boot against gravel. Then, still again. He doesn't growl. Doesn't bolt. Mira kneels slowly, her cello case beside her. The motion is practiced, reverent. She doesn't look at Argon yet. Instead, she opens the case with care, the way one might open a music box left behind by a loved one. Each movement is quiet, offering no threatening presence. The cello emerges like a memory-warm wood against pale morning. Mira adjusts the end pin into the earth, tightens the bow with deliberate fingers, then rests the instrument against her shoulder. The air between them hums with quiet tension. Then music. The opening of Claire's lullaby unfurls like a whispered secret. It's not loud, not demanding. It curls into the empty space between them like steam rising from a warm cup on a cold day. Mira's bow moves gently, drawing out tones that barely disturb the silence, only soften it. And Argon listens. He doesn't come forward, not right away, but his body loosens, fractionally. His jaw doesn't clench. His tail doesn't tuck. There is no recoil in his shoulders. His eyes, usually flickering between threat and escape, settle not on Mira, but on the sound. Then, almost imperceptibly, he moves. One paw forward, then another. He doesn't approach directly. His path is a slow, arc-wide, uncertain, but it is movement nonetheless. He skirts the edge of the enclosure, body low but not hostile. Ears forward, breathing steady. He makes a slow, looping half-circle, never turning his back, never closing the distance fully but circling, observing. Mira plays through the shifting air, never changing tempo. Her own breath hitches only once when she feels the gravity of it. The silent permission in his movement. She doesn't meet his eyes. This isn't about dominance or invitation. It's about space. It's about offering him the first note of a shared language. Halfway through the second passage, Argon stops 10 feet away. His posture is strange, neither fully guarded nor relaxed. He tilts his head slightly, and for the first time since Mira met him, he blinks slowly, like he's watching something not out of fear, but curiosity. Then he does something she didn't expect. He sits. Just sits. Still tense, still wary, but grounded, present. Mira's hands tremble, but the bow doesn't slip. The melody continues deeper now, richer, like the earth beneath them is listening too. She doesn't speak. She barely dares to breathe. She finishes the piece slowly, letting the final note drift between them like a feather. Silence follows, but it's not empty. It's full of everything that hadn't been possible before. Mira lowers the cello gently, resting her palm against its body. Her voice is quiet, as if speaking too loud might shatter the moment. "This is yours too now," she says, her eyes on the ground, not on him. There's no reply. Only the sound of wind brushing dry leaves along the fence line, and Argon's slow exhalia sound that is almost peaceful. She looks up. He hasn't moved, but something in his eyes has. They aren't wild, not quite soft either, but clear, present. There's no panic, no reflex. Just listening. For a long while, neither of them moves. Time softens at the edges. A crow calls somewhere in the pine ridge, but Argon doesn't react. He watches Mira not as a threat, but as something new. Something uncertain, yes, but not dangerous. Mira finally stands, legs stiff from the cold. She backs away without turning, gently replacing the cello in its case. Her breath fogs the morning air as she whispers again, barely audible. "You don't have to come closer. Just know I'll be here." Argon blinks. She backs out of the enclosure, slow and deliberate, and gently shuts the gate behind her. The latch clicks not like a trap, but like a seal. A promise. From the staff building, across the yard, Dr. Klein watches through the observation monitor, arms folded. He says nothing, doesn't log the moment, but his gaze lingers on the still figure of Argon and the empty place Mira had just been. Later that night, Mira reviews the security feed again. She doesn't fast forward. She watches in real time. She sees Argon sniff the ground where she had stood, just once. Then, quietly, he lies down in the same spot. The sky was still pale when Mira returned to the enclosure, cello in hand, bow tucked beneath her arm. Dew clung to the grass in soft glimmers, catching the low morning sun like it was trying to remember how to shine. The cold had softened over night spring, reaching with tentative fingers through the winter's heavy veil. Argon was already awake. She could tell by the tension in his posture, the way his body hovered near the far fence line, but his eyes flicked in her direction the moment she appeared. He didn't growl. He didn't turn away. He just watched. Mira knelt beside her case and carefully lifted out the bow. But this time, she didn't begin to play right away. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and unwrapped a small bundle of worn velvet. Nestled inside, it was a silver dog collar tag, dulled around the edges, letters barely visible. But Mira knew every line, every groove. Her thumb passed across the raised heart etched above the name, Claire. She held it there for a moment in her palm, catching the morning light. The tag didn't jingle. It had grown quiet with age, its clinking years long gone. But in her mind, it rang, with a sound only memory could hear. "I used to think this sound could bring her back," Mira said quietly. She wasn't speaking to the wolf dog, not directly, But her voice carried across the space, gentle and unsure. Like maybe metal against wood could unfold time. Argon didn't move, but his ears turned both of them. Mira took the tag and tied it carefully to the base of her cello bow, using a thin cord she'd braided herself the night before. A gesture small enough to go unnoticed by most, but to her, it was sacred. Her mother had once told her that music was a form of return. Not escape return. Return to a feeling, a room, a scent, a warmth that hadn't vanished, only hidden. Mira tucked the bow beneath her arm again and looked across the field at Argon. She used to play for the frightened ones, she continued, for the ones no one could reach, and they listened. Not because they understood, but because they felt that she did. Her fingers trembled slightly not from cold, but from something older, deeper. She pressed them into the strings and drew the first low note. The sound came soft and unhurried. It hovered just above the frost-lined grass, dipped between the wind's long sighs, and rested in the spaces Argon's silence allowed. He didn't approach, but he didn't withdraw either. His body was alert but not braced. His eyes flickered, then held steady. Each movement of the bow carried the faint chime of the collar tag, barely audible, yet somehow felt like a whisper inside the music itself. Mira kept playing, the notes weaving one into the next with that same aching tenderness her mother used to summon. Claire's lullaby, but slower this time, personal, weighted with grief that no longer needed fixing, just naming. When she paused, her bow hanging in the air for a breath, Argon did something she did not expect. He took a step forward. Not bold, not sudden, just a step. And then another. His eyes stayed on the cello, then flicked to her hands, then to her face. And as the wind moved, carrying the warm, worn scent of rosin and wool and the memory of someone long gone, he veered slightly to the side and circled not wide, not guarded, but cautious, curious. Mira didn't speak. She didn't shift. She waited. And then a nudge. Not to her. To the cello stand. Argon's nose pressed briefly against its wooden base as if testing its stability, its presence. Then he stepped back and lay down not far, not curled up yet, but there, with her, in shared air. Mira didn't cry. Not the way she had before. Instead, her throat swelled with something quieter, a gratitude without words. A breath held too long, finally exhaled. She bent gently over the instrument, fingers returning to the strings, and drew another note. The tag chimed faintly again, and this time it felt like an offering. "This is hers," she whispered half to the sky. "But now, it can be yours too." Argon didn't flinch. His ears twitched at the sound, but his body remained still, his eyes half-lidded as if listening required everything he had. The tag glinted in the sun as Mira played on, the melody folding back over itself like a memory being rethreaded, not replaced. And the space between girl and wolf dog, between grief and trust, between silence and song began to breathe. The fog rolled in early that evening, a soft silver hush that coated the trees and turned the training center's perimeter lights into dull halos. Mira didn't mind the quiet. In truth, she welcomed it. The fog softened edges, muffled judgments, and wrapped her in the kind of stillness that felt closer to music than silence ever could. She sat on the bench outside the enclosure, her cello resting against her chest like a familiar weight. There was no plan tonight, no clipboard, no specific technique to test, only the pull of the bow and the memory of Claire's lullaby drifting through her fingertips. The tune had grown with Heronsay a child's nighttime comfort, now a language she spoke when words were too heavy. Argon was further back tonight. He hadn't approached since morning. He'd been still, half hidden near the tall pine trunk that marked the far edge of his space. Watching, breathing. She began to play. The first note crept out like a thread of light weaving through mist. Mira kept her eyes lowered, bow hand steady, as the melody unfurled with a quiet longing. Claire's lullaby had always been slow, meant to hush trembling hearts, to slow the thrum of panic behind a ribcage. But tonight, Mira didn't just play for Argon. She played for the ones who never came home, for the unnamed, unclaimed, for the ones who waited behind fences and never understood why no one ever returned. And as her bow slowed, as the last note bent into air like breath leaving a body, she heard it, Not a bark, not a growl. A low, raw sound that split the air with more ache than defiance. A howl. Mira froze. The note died under her fingers, swallowed by the fog. Her chest rose sharply. For a moment she thought she'd imagined it. But then, from the mist-shrouded enclosure, the sound came again. A fragile, mournful howl. Untrained, uncertain, like something long buried, had clawed its way to the surface and didn't yet know its shape. Argon. Her bow dropped softly to her side as she turned. He wasn't behind the pine anymore. He was closer now, standing just a few feet from the fence. His head tilted up, ears forward, but not alert, not aggressive. His eyes glistened with something older than fear. Grief. His mouth parted again. Another howl rose up, softer this time. Drawn from some dim corridor of memory he couldn't name. Mira's hands began to tremble, not from fear, but because something about the sound, the rawness, the loneliness hit a place in her chest she thought she'd boarded up years ago. She stood, bow still in hand. "Argon," she whispered. He didn't flinch, didn't step back. He just looked at her, as though hearing her for the first time, not as a handler or even a presence to tolerate, but something more human, someone who might have lost something too. "You were calling someone, weren't you?" she asked, voice low, like she was asking the night itself. The fog hung thick between them. He lowered his head slowly. The movement felt deliberate, soft, almost shameful, as if he hadn't meant for the sound to escape him, as if that howl had betrayed a secret. Mira stepped closer, only half a pace, careful not to breach whatever unspoken line he'd drawn between them. Her eyes stung. She didn't blink, because suddenly she was no longer standing in the present. She was 6 again, curled in a hallway closet during a storm that cracked the world open outside. And in the darkness, she'd howled too. Not with her voice, but with her bones. A grief too small for language, but too big to hold alone. "I know what it's like," she said, her voice barely air. "To cry for someone when you don't even know if they're listening." Argon blinked slowly, the way animals do when they're choosing not to run. The cello strings still vibrated faintly behind her, like memory. And for a moment, the fog didn't feel cold. It felt like a veil between two beings who had both been broken open by things they didn't ask for. "I'm still here," she said. "If you ever want to call again." Oh, she didn't ask for another note, or another step, or more trust than he could give. But as she turned to go, heart full and quiet, she heard it once more. A final, aching howl, softer than the last, but no less real. Mira didn't cry until she reached the far bench by the outer gates. And even then, the tears came gently, like something finally answered. The first snow came quietly, as if the sky had grown tired of wind. No gusts, no announcement, just the hush of something softer settling into the bones of the world. Mira stood at the edge of the field beside the enclosure, her breath blooming in the cold, eyes on the heavy clouds folding over the horizon like blankets. The wind had held back for once, allowing the flakes to fall slow and vertical. Tiny crystals turned her scarf to lace. She didn't brush them off. She didn't bring the cello this time. There were no lullabies in her throat tonight, no melodies clinging to her fingers. Only silence. Not the kind that pressed or weighed, but the kind that invited. Mira entered the enclosure slowly, without ceremony. No treats, no leash, no expectations. She wore no gloves. The cold kissed her fingers raw, but it helped her stay present, helped her feel. She crossed the snow-dusted grass and sank to the ground cross-legged, eyes soft, her hands resting open on her knees. No voice called out, no words filled the air. She simply was. Argon had been pacing near the far tree line when she arrived, his silhouette brushing against the falling snow like a dream nearly forgotten. But now he stopped, head up, watching, ears twitching toward the lack of sound. There was something about quiet that animals understood in a way people rarely could. Not awkwardness or void, but a kind of offering. Argon did not run. He didn't bolt like he used to whenever her footsteps crossed a boundary, spoken or not. Instead, he began walking. Not directly to her. Not quite. But his path curved closer than before. Closer than it ever had without the barrier of fence or distance. He walked until the sound of his paws crunching faintly over snow stopped just short of her reach. And there, without warning, he lay down. Not curled, not tense. He lay on his side, facing outward, like a sentinel beside a soul he didn't yet understand but had begun to accept. They sat that way, no touch, no command, only presence. Snow gathered gently on Mira's shoulders, clung to her lashes. Her breath came slow, visible in the space between them. For a moment, she didn't dare a blink, because it felt sacred. Argon exhaled, low and steady. The kind of sigh, not born from exhaustion, but recognition. Something inside her ached at the sound. Not pain, not sadness. Something older. Something she'd almost forgotten. The feeling of being trusted. And though her eyes burned and her throat ached with unshed tears, Mira didn't move, didn't disrupt the fragile truce of stillness. Because tonight, the snowfall didn't scare him. And neither did she. The moon crept above the tree line, silvering the field, making crystals out of every branch. In the faint light, Argon's coat shimmered with quiet life. His ear flicked once, then settled. At some point, minutes, hours, she couldn't tell. He turned his head slightly, just enough that one amber eye met hers. There was no fear in it, no demand, no question. Just being. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. She only nodded, barely emotion. A thank you, spoken without sound. In the stillness, Mira didn't think about the scars beneath Argon's fur, didn't think about the staff who still doubted, or the reports piling up on her desk, or the next step in his rehabilitation chart. In the stillness, there was no past or future. Only now, only snow, falling slow and even. Only the silent companionship of two broken things, choosing just for this moment not to run, and that was enough. The field behind the center stretched like a quiet breath barren this time of year, still clutching the frost of morning even as the sun broke across the tree line. Thin blades of dormant grass crackled beneath Mira's boots as she unlatched the final gate. Argon stood inside the pen, shoulders tense, eyes tracing her movement the way he always did, now without fear, but not without question. His breath made small clouds in the cold air, curling and vanishing like something half-remembered. Mira didn't speak. She didn't need to anymore. She simply stepped aside, fingers still resting on the gate latch. The metal chilled against her skin, and then she opened it slowly, deliberately, like opening a story she didn't know the ending of. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Argon stepped forward, not fast, not frantic, just a single paw against snow-dusted earth, then another, testing the open space like it might disappear. And then he ran. It wasn't the run of a creature trying to flee. It wasn't the wild, panicked sprint of the day he'd first arrived, crashing against walls, eyes wide with the ache of something broken and forgotten. This was different. His legs stretched long across the open space, fluid and light. The breath in his lungs came not in gulps but in rhythm, like music, like wind threading through reeds. He turned toward the trees, not into them, just close enough to let their shadows slip across his fur, then arced wide in a loose, bounding circle. His tail lifted like a question left hanging. Mira stood still, wrapped in her coat and the silence of wonder. He wasn't escaping. He was remembering what it meant to feel his own strength. She exhaled, hand closing over the whistle in her pocket. She hadn't planned to use it, maybe not ever. But something inside her, half instinct, half memory, reached for it now. She lifted it gently to her lips, letting it release one single note. It wasn't loud. It wasn't command. It was barely more than a breath shaped by silver. Argon stopped, 30 feet out, in the middle of the field where the frost hadn't yet melted. His ears twitched. He turned his head, not all the way, just enough that one eye met her. Not afraid, not defiant, just aware. And then something in his chest moved. Mira couldn't see it. Not exactly, but she felt it, as if the thread between them, once fragile and frayed, had suddenly held firm. He didn't come running back, but he didn't keep running either. He stood in place, letting the wind play through his fur, the light of the rising sun casting golden softness on the slope of his shoulders. She watched his breath steady, watched the way he blinked slowly, and somehow knew This wasn't the old instinct to flee rearing up. This was trust, tested and not withdrawn. Mira lowered the whistle, let her arm fall to her side. She whispered, "That's enough." It wasn't to call him back. It wasn't a cue or a rule. It was something else entirely. A kind of permission. For him, for herself, for this quiet space they were learning to share without touching. The wind lifted a small spray of snow from the hill, carrying with it the scent of pine, of earth waking beneath the frost. Argon closed his eyes briefly as it passed over him. And then, almost without thought, he began to walk. Not fast, not in a line, but toward her. Mira didn't move. She didn't need to. He didn't come all the way. He stopped about 10 feet from her, body angled slightly away, but his gaze lingered. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't fear. It was presence. And presence was everything. She let her knees bend, folding down into a crouch, feeling the cold soak through the fabric of her jeans. She smiled, not the broad kind, but the one that sits in the corner of the mouth, stitched from equal parts gratitude and ache. "I don't know what they took from you," she said softly, voice barely a thread, "but you get to take this back." Argon didn't flinch. Behind him, the field remained quiet. Beyond that, the tree line murmured in low winter language, branches shifting, snow dripping in soft pulses from the canopy. Everything in this moment had weight, but no pressure. She reached into her coat pocket, not for a treat, not for a leash. Just a single pine cone she'd picked up earlier from the tree where she used to sit as a child, the one her mother had said held all the notes too quiet for a cello. She rolled it between her fingers, then set it gently in the snow between them. "I used to bring these to her grave when I couldn't speak yet," she whispered, eyes fixed on the small brown gift. "Sometimes they were the only thing that felt like they belonged." And Argon's ears moved forward, subtle. He stepped one pace closer. Not to take the pine cone, not to investigate, just closer. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed gently with the kind of knowing that doesn't need words, the kind that lives in breath, in shared earth, in the stillness between movements in a piece not yet finished. Off-leash didn't mean unbound. For the first time, Mira realized neither of them was. The training field behind the facility had thawed into patches of half-melted snow and stubborn earth. Staff jackets flapped in the late morning wind as Mira stood on the edge of the open space, arms folded, her breath white and slow. She hadn't asked for this, but they had insisted. 3 staff members, all experienced handlers, formed a semicircle near the center. One held a clipboard, one tapped a treat pouch. Another adjusted the frequency on a collar they hadn't yet dared to put on Argon. The dog in question stood a few feet away, eyes sharp, stance rigid. His coat caught the winter light like brushed iron. He wasn't snarling, wasn't cowering. He was simply watching. "Let's start simple," said the lead trainer, voice clipped. "Sit." He held out a closed fist, as if holding a reward. His tone was practiced, neutral, the kind meant to elicit a conditioned response. Argon didn't flinch. He didn't move at all. "Sit," the trainer repeated, firmer now. "Sits." Nothing. The clipboard trainer jotted something. Mira stepped forward a half pace. "He doesn't respond to German, or English, or food. That's not how he works." They ignored her. "Down," said the second handler, switching it up, body lowered slightly, open palm gesturing toward the ground. Argon blinked once. A single slow movement of his amber eyes toward Mira, then back. Still nothing. The clipboard scribbled again. "Try recall," said the lead. The second trainer gave a short whistle, then opened his arms as if inviting a run. "Here, boy. Come." That word comet landed heavy in the air. Mira felt her fingers curl tight in her sleeves. Argon didn't run. He didn't even shift weight. His tail stayed still, limbs locked like some internal storm was pressing against glass. "Unresponsive," the handler murmured. "He's either not trained or he's suppressing." "He's not suppressing," Mira cut in. "He's surviving." They turned to her. One raised a brow. She took a breath, walking slowly toward Argon, careful not to step in front of him too fast. "He's not broken," she said, voice steady but not loud. "He's just tired of being tested." Argon's ears flicked at her voice. Mira lowered herself to the ground, cross-legged. No command, no coaxing, just being. The handlers watched. A long pause passed. Argon stood for another 10-second stone, still before he began to move. Not toward the handlers, not toward any offered treat or beckoning hand. He moved toward her. Each step was deliberate. Not cautious, not tentative, but intentional as if crossing some invisible line between what was expected of him and what he chose for himself. He reached Mira and stood beside her. Then, without a sound, he folded himself down. Not in the rigid down they'd asked for, but in a slow, loose sprawl of limbs and breath. His side touched hers. His head settled near her boot. One of the handlers broke the silence.
He's not obeying. He's just lying there.
Mira looked up, meeting the trainer's eyes. No, she said softly. He's trusting. The clipboard trainer stopped writing. Mira let her hand rest near Argon's shoulder. Not touching, just present. His ears didn't flick. His body didn't stiffen. In the quiet space between them, something fragile began to settle. Not mastery, not dominance, just being seen. I'm not training a soldier, Mira said, rising slowly so as not to startle him. I'm witnessing a survivor. The handlers didn't respond. Argon stayed down, not because he was told to, because he had chosen to. The gravel in the driveway crackled under the weight of unfamiliar tires. Mira heard it first. Then, so did Argon. His ears stiffened, nose lifted to the windless sky. No growl, no retreat. Just that alert stillness of a creature who knew how quickly quiet could become danger. She stood at the porch's edge, one hand resting on the frame of the door, the other instinctively near her side close, but not touching Argon. He hadn't worn a collar in weeks. She hadn't forced him. A silver SUV rolled to a soft stop beside the old oak. A woman stepped out, too carefully dressed for the weather coat pressed, scarf styled, boots clean. Her photographer followed, lens already unslung, eyes already searching. Mira didn't move. The woman approached with that practiced half-smile meant to charm but rarely reaching the eyes. "Hi there. You must be Mira," she said, offering a gloved hand. "I'm Leona Fielding with the Chronicle Weekly. We spoke over email?" Mira nodded once, dry-mouthed. "You said it was about rescue dogs." "Well," Leona chuckled, stepping back to glance at Argon, who stood just behind Mira, now broad frame tense, eyes wary. "More about resilience, overcoming odds, that kind of story. Your Argon's become something of a curiosity." Mira didn't answer. Her gaze flicked to the camera. "Mind if we take a few shots? Just candid. We'd love to capture you two as you are. Define as we are," Mira said quietly. Leona tilted her head like one might toward a child who asks something a little too clever. Real. Unfiltered. People connect with vulnerability. Argon shifted behind her. Mira caught the Changeneau fear. Not aggression, just a warning tightening of his breath. The way he looked toward the woods, as if already planning an exit. She crouched, slow and steady, beside him. "He's not a curiosity," she said, barely above the breeze. "He's not a headline." Leona's smile didn't falter. "Of course. We just want to show people the bond between you. You know, healing, second chances." The camera clicked. Once. Then, again faster now. And Argon froze, like a door slammed shut inside him. His chest held tight. He didn't flinch, didn't bark. But the flash turned his eyes into something far away, like glass cupping a memory too old to name. A low sound curled in his throat knot, growling, not crying, just caught between. "Stop," Mira said, standing quickly. "Don't take another one." The photographer paused, unsure. "I said stop." Leona raised a hand. "It's okay. Some animals just need a moment. He'll adjust." Mira stepped between Argon and the lens. Her shadow covered him completely. "He doesn't need to adjust. You do." There was steel in her voice now. Not loud, just resolute like a lock clicking into place. The woman blinked. "We're not here to upset anyone, Mira. But he's part of a military program, isn't he? People want to know what happens when they don't to fulfill expectations." "Fulfill," Mira echoed bitterly. She looked down at Argon. His eyes were on her now. He hadn't moved, but he was trembling, barely visible, except in the way his back leg pressed a little tighter into the earth. as if he was waiting to be judged again, as if he was already failing. Mira crouched beside him, gently brushing her fingers against the thick fur near his shoulder. Not control, not restraint, just contact. "You don't owe anyone a performance," she whispered to him. "Not them, not the world, not even me." Argan blinked slowly, then exhaled, not a sigh of relief. Not yet. But something inside him softened. His haunches sank lower, belly against the ground. But his gaze stayed steady. "I thought you wanted to inspire people," Leona said, her tone edging toward disappointment. "You've got something rare here, a story of redemption. You could reach so many." Mira stood again. "He doesn't exist to prove anything." The woman crossed her arms, trying to hold ground.
He's part of a publicly funded program. There's curiosity, concern about outcomes.
Mira's voice dropped. "He's not an outcome." The photographer lowered his camera. He glanced at Argan, then at Mirand, seemed to understand something Leona had not. "This isn't your angle," Mira said, softer now. "You want the neat version, the train redemption arc. But that's not what's happening here." "So what is happening?" Leona asked, genuinely puzzled. "Survival," Mira said, "and trust, but the kind that doesn't look impressive on command." Leona hesitated, then muttered something about respecting boundaries and gestured for the photographer to pack up. They left without further protest, the tires stirring up brown leaves as they turned back down the path. Mira stood in the quiet that followed, her breath a soft cloud in the air. Argan nudged her hand with his nose. No whine, no demand, just presence. "I'm sorry," she said to him. "I didn't know they'd come like that. Shoulda guessed." Argan stepped forward and sat beside her, not obediently, but intentionally, choosing proximity over distance. For a long moment, they watched the driveway empty. The trees whispered with the breeze that hadn't been there earlier. Snow hadn't come yet, but the sky held that dense stillness before a hush. Mira reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper, the one the shelter had handed her on the first day, listing Argan's failed evaluations. She crouched by the porch and pressed it gently into the slats of firewood. "Not yours anymore," she said. Argan watched her, then looked back to the woods. "Not afraid now, just aware." As if to say, "I remember what they did, but I'm still here." The sound came not like thunder, but like a low groan from the belly of the earth, a dull shift beneath the snow-covered ridge that framed the outer trail of the sanctuary. Mira had only taken Argan out for a quick stretch. She knew better than to stray too far. But the mountain had its own rules. At first, she thought it might be distant construction. Then the snow under her boots trembled. Not violently, but just enough to still the breath in her chest. She turned just in time to see the upper bluff release its burden. A sheet of white broke free, soundless at first, then rushing with a moaning roar that drowned the wind. It wasn't aimed toward them, not directly, but the tremor shifted the landscape, tipping decades of fallen trunks and snow-heavy branches into a heap that spilled between her and Argan. She fell backward instinctively, landing with a soft woof in the powder. Her heart drummed inside her ribs. When she sat up, Argan was no longer beside her. "Argan?" A flash of tan and black darted along the edge of the snowfield, blocked off by the new mound of collapsed trail. He hadn't bolted far, only a dozen yards, but a massive, tangled blockade of logs, snow, and jagged rock stood between them now. The path had split clean through. "Stay there," she called, but her voice felt swallowed in the hush after the avalanche. Argan didn't bark. He never barked. But he paced tight loops, then wider, his ears pinned back. He whined, low and tremulous, every so often raising his front paws against the pile as if to test its strength. Mira stood slowly. No signal, no reception. The sky had turned a dull pewter, evening light smothered in the storm-gray hush of post-collapse silence. She moved closer to the new divide, careful not to disturb the loose snow. The mound was too steep, too unstable to climb without rope or gear. "Argan," she whispered again, but her voice shook now. "It's okay. I'm here." But Argan had begun to panic. His eyes darted. His pacing grew erratic, tail down low, shoulders hunched. He made a sound then Mira had never heard from him, not a growl, not a bark, but a throaty, desperate noise, somewhere between a moan and a plea. Her hand reached for her coat pocket, more by instinct than thought. Her phone, no bars. But music didn't need reception. She opened the voice memo app. The screen was cracked at the corner, and her fingers trembled with the cold and the strain of what to do next. And then she remembered it. The note she had recorded late one night. A cello linear finished, a little uneven. Just a few measures she had played alone in the cabin when sleep had refused to come. She had never meant to keep it. It was barely more than a hum in string. But it was hers. And, she hoped, his too. She hit play. The sound was faint at first. The little speaker was no match for open air and distance. But the melody carried. A single line of bowed string. Slow, gentle, unsure of itself, but not broken. Argon stopped. His body froze mid-pace. Ears twitching. Head tilted. Mira held the phone out, lifted as if offering more of it into the wind. The melody swelled not louder, just fuller. The note dipped low, then lifted. One loop, then another. A pause where breath might go. Then the line again. Argon took one step closer to the mound and sat. Not slouched, not collapsed in panic. He sat. Still. His head raised, not to howl, not to challenge, but as if to meet the note halfway. Mira's throat tightened. She didn't speak, didn't dare. She let the music play through, her hand numb now from cold and the ache of holding on to something invisible but needed. When the last note faded, Argon remained still. His chest rose and fell in slow rhythm. No pacing, no whines. Just quiet. They stood on opposite sides of the fallen world, but the stillness between them felt not like loss, but like something shared. Mira slowly lowered the phone. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse but steady. "We'll get home, okay?" Argon didn't move, but his eyes stayed locked on hers. It was enough. The snow had fallen in uneven heaps along the trail's bend. A white silence layered over the land like folded cloth. Mira's boots made dull sounds as she moved. The soft crunch dulled by the thickening fog. Her breath was visible in slow, shallow clouds. She hadn't expected to go this far today, but something had pulled her along the outer path, by the enclosure path she rarely walked alone. A sound. Not loud, just not right. At first, it had been a thump, or maybe a shift, like snow giving way under weight not its own. Mira paused, tilted her head. Her fingers tightened on the edge of her coat. Then came the whisper of something trying to be a voice, muffled, strangled by cold and collapse. She ran. She didn't think, just followed the slope downward, between the narrow clefts of pine until she saw the snow was no longer smooth, a mound disrupted. Then fingers, human fingers blew, at the tips trembling just above the ice-crusted surface, barely moving. Oh God! Mira dropped to her knees, the cold shooting through her jeans like needles. Her hands clawed through the snow, frantic, bare, reddening. "Hey, I'm here. I see you." Her voice cracked. "Hold on, okay? Just hold on." The face was a man's, young, pale, blood at the hairline. Snow pressed into the angle of his neck like a weight trying to bury memory. His lips parted, but no words came out. Just a soft croak. "I can't," she breathed, realizing it then. There were rocks beneath the snow, and one wide, jagged pinning his leg. "I can't move this alone." Her head whipped back, eyes scanning the empty trail. Argon was nowhere in sight. She stood, heart pounding, voice rising into the still air. "Argon!" she called, then louder. "Argon!" Her voice fractured at the edge of desperation. For a moment, nothing. Then, the sound of snow shifting uphill, a flash of dark against the white. Ears pricked, body tense. He saw her. She raised both arms, waving. "Here, down here." Argon hesitated. The distance between them was scattered with icy rocks and snowdrifts. His body stiffened as he stared at her, ears flicking back. "Please," Mira called again, voice softer this time. "I need you." The wind pressed against her back. Somewhere nearby, a crow cried. Argon inched forward, 2 steps, 3, then stopped again, whining low, his body unsure, shifting in place. Mira dropped to her knees again beside the man, brushing more snow away from his face, from his chest. "I can't do this without you," she whispered. not sure if she was speaking to Argon anymore or to someone else, long gone. Her mother, the quiet part of herself that had always been the one who waited for help, not asked for it. Her eyes rose. Argon was watching, not the way a dog watches a command, but the way a soul listens for permission. And then he moved. A slow descent, step by careful step. Down the ridge. Toward her. The moment his paws touched the circle of collapsed snow, she felt something loosen in her chest. "Good boy," she murmured. "Good boy, Argon." She pointed toward the pinned leg. "There, dig there." He looked at her, long, unwavering. Then, without ceremony, without command, he began. His front paws swept snow aside with practiced rhythm. Not fast, not like instinct, but steady, intentional, a rhythm that said, "I understand." The snow flew in arcs behind him, each stroke clearing more of the burden, more of the weight that did not belong to the man beneath. The man groaned. Mira leaned closer. "We've got you. You're not alone." Minutes passed. Mira joined in, scraping at the lighter powder near the edges, her fingers raw now, but not feeling the cold anymore, just the urgency. The shared heartbeat between her and the dog, who had once forgotten how to trust. Argon paused only once, looked up at her, then continued. The rock half visible now began to budge. Together, they rocked it, inch by inch. Mira braced her shoulder against it. One more time, ready? Argon pushed with his whole body, not trained, not obedient, just present. The stone slid just enough. A gasp escaped the man's mouth, pain and air and life all rushing out in one fragile breath. They had made a pocket. Enough. Mira knelt beside him, brushing snow from his lashes. "Help's coming," she whispered. "Just hold on." She didn't know how far the rescue was. The signal had been weak, but she'd called, and they'd heard her. Beside her, Argon sat now. Not alert. Not waiting for praise. Just near. His side, touching her arm. She looked at him, the snow in his fur, the dirt beneath his nails. And then, not needing to say anything more, she laid her hand on his shoulder. For the first time since they met, he didn't flinch. The man beneath the snow stirred again, a sound escaping his lips like a question. Mira leaned in. "You're going to be okay," she said, because he came. The air was thin, heavy with the dampness of snow that had only just begun to settle again. Beneath a sky bruised with the fading tones of stormlight, Mira knelt beside the half-buried hiker, her gloved hands raw from scraping at ice and gravel, her breath coming out in short, desperate puffs. The woman was alive, barely. A faint tremble ran through her body each time Mira whispered to her. The whisper wasn't much just a repetition of her name, again and again, as if language alone could anchor someone to the edge of life. "Stay with me, please," Mira murmured, her voice cracking. She wiped at her cheek with the back of her sleeve. Not from tears, but from melted frost. Her fingers were red, her legs numb. Still, she dug. And then, behind her footsteps. Not heavy, not rushed, measured. Argon. He didn't bark, didn't whine. Just came and stood beside her, his breath misting in the cold air. His ears perked forward. Mira turned toward him slowly, lips parted, eyes unsure. "She's under there," she said softly, motioning with her chin toward the mound of ice-stained snow. Argon didn't move right away. He sniffed the air, lowered his head, his body, stilled. Then something changed. His shoulders shifted, his ears pivoted not backward in fear but forward in focus, as if something ancient had stirred beneath his ribs. A memory not taught, but born. Without being told, Argon stepped closer. He sniffed again longer this time and moved his nose over the snow until it landed on the faintest pocket of breath escaping the buried woman's mouth. And he froze. A single moment. Then he began to dig. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't wild. It was precise. His forepaws moved in rhythm. Left, then right. Then pause. Then again. Each motion sent clumps of wet snow flying off to the side. Mira let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "You remember?" she whispered. Argon didn't look at her. He didn't need to. His attention was locked. His body lean, taut, shadowed by layers of winter's mist, was a conduit of purpose. The mound softened under his effort. Snow fell away in sheets. Mira joined in, brushing debris from the side, clearing space with her forearms. A corner of the woman's jacket emerged, then a sleeve, then her cheek. Blue. Mira's hands flew to her phone, fingers fumbling through her emergency call app. No signal. Of course not. She looked to Argon. He had stopped. His nose was just above the woman's mouth, checking. Still breath. He began digging again, this time toward her legs, exposing more of her body so Mira could check for injuries. He was clearing enough for a rescue to matter. "Good boy," she whispered. "But it's not just good. It's right. She wasn't sure who she was saying it to him. The wind, herself. But Argon didn't need the words. He knew. Snow clung to his muzzle. His sides heaved gently, but he didn't pause. Not once. Mira had seen dogs trained their whole lives for these moments. But Argon wasn't trained. He was broken, discarded, forgotten. And yether he was, doing not what he'd been taught, but what he chose. As the sun dipped further, shadows stretched like arms across the field. The air was thickening again with snowfall. It came light at first, tiny flakes, kissing the earth, almost shy, then stronger, bolder. Mira shivered. She took off her jacket, laid it across the woman's exposed chest. Her own arms burned from cold. She looked at Argon, crouched beside the hiker now. He had stopped digging. He didn't move away. He simply laid beside her just close enough for warmth. Not touching. Eyes alert. Body still. Mira blinked at the sight. It wasn't obedience. It was instinct. It was choice. It was care. From the ridge above, the crunch of boots echoed faintly. Rescuers, finally. Their shouts barely cut through the wind. Mira stood, waving frantically. "Down here! Hurry!" They came, two men. One woman carrying thermal blankets and radio gear. One of them knelt beside the hiker immediately, taking vitals. The others turned to Mira. "Did you find her?" one asked. Mira shook her head and looked at Argon. "He did. Argon lifted his eyes at the sound of her voice, but didn't rise. He stayed right where he wasn't, steady, his body forming a quiet barrier between the stranger and the cold. The medic looked up. "She's lucky. A few more minutes, and she might not have made it." Mira didn't speak, just nodded, the sting of wind biting at her eyes. A camera clicked behind them. One of the rescue staff had taken out a phone to snap a photo. Argon flinched. Mira turned sharply. "No pictures." The man lowered his phone. Argon finally looked at her. Not as a command, not for permission, just connection. Mira stepped forward and knelt beside him. She touched the side of his face gently, brushing off snow. "I saw it," she whispered. "I saw who you were before they broke you." Argon didn't wag his tail. He didn't need to. Somewhere beneath the noise of rescue gear, the distant echoes of the avalanche, and the hush of falling snow, there was something else. Stillness. A kind of stillness earned, not given. Forged in the cold, held in breath, shared between a girl and a dog, kneeling beside a stranger they'd brought back from the edge. And in that stillness, instinct didn't need a name. It only needed to be remembered. The phone wouldn't stop buzzing. It rattled against the desk, then the floor, its light flickering across the walls like a beacon someone forgot to turn off. Mira didn't reach for it. She sat, curled on the edge of her cot, arms wrapped around her knees, her cheek resting against the faded fabric of her sweatshirt. Outside, the wind howled against the walls of the center, stirring up powdery snow in slow spirals. Argon lay near the door, his breathing soft, tail twitching with each small sound. He was watching her not with worry, but with presence, that quiet kind of nearness she had come to rely on, more than words. The first news headline had come just before sunrise. Mira had been brushing Argon's fur, humming under her breath, when Dr. Leland entered the room with a tablet in her hand and something unreadable on her face. Without speaking, she turned the screen around. "Untrainable dog saves life after music therapy. The survivor and the girl who wouldn't give up. From rejection to redemption. One after another." Major outlets. Morning. Shows. Even a glossy photo of Mira kneeling beside the snowbank, her mittened hand on Argon's back, his body low beside the injured hiker. They had captured it from a drone above unbeknownst to her. The girl and the dog, silhouettes etched into snow and shadow. It should have felt like a victory. But the noise of it all made her chest tighten. Every interview request, every call from strangers who hadn't asked her name before, now wanted to know everything. What had she done to fix him? Could she speak about healing through melody? Would she bring Argon to New York for a live segment? She hadn't fixed him. He wasn't broken. She looked toward him now. He was sleeping again, one paw curled over the other, his ribs rising and falling in steady rhythm. That soft whimper from his dream, she could feel it in her chest like a memory. Later that morning, Mira sat in the common room with the rest of the staff. Someone had wheeled in a television. It buzzed with static before settling on a morning segment already in progress. A woman with perfect teeth and a wintry blue dress smiled into the camera. "What's remarkable," she said, "is that Argon had been labeled unfit for duty. He failed every basic test. But somehow, under the care of a young, volunteer-only 17, mind you, this failure dog saved a human life." They rolled the footage. Mira in a too-big coat. Argon digging through snow. The headline bold across the bottom, "The dog who listened to music and found his purpose." Around her, staff members clapped. Dr. Leland leaned down, placing a hand gently on Mira's shoulder. "You did good," she whispered. But all Mira could hear was the word purpose, echoing like a judgment, as if a single moment in a blizzard had defined him, as if the days of silence, the trembling nights, the way he had learned to lie beside her without command, meant nothing until the cameras turned. She stood quietly and slipped out the door. The cold met her like a familiar coat. She didn't mind it anymore. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she made her way down the trail. The trees stood bare and tall around her, their limbs heavy with white. Somewhere behind her, the world buzzed with stories they didn't ask permission to tell. By the old bench near the tree line, Mira paused and sat. She hadn't brought her cello. Not today. But she hummed, soft and low, a tune Argon knew well, a melody she once played in the dark, back when neither of them trusted the quiet. She let it drift into the cold, like a small bird, unafraid of being heard. Moments later, she felt his weight beside her. Argon didn't nudge hair, didn't bark. He simply sat, back straight, head tilted toward the sky where flakes had begun to fall, again soft as ash, slow as breath. "You don't owe them anything," she whispered. Argon blinked slowly. She reached over, laying her hand on the rough warmth of his neck. "You did that because you knew someone needed you. Not because you were trained to. Not because someone clapped or gave a treat." He sighed, resting his chin gently on her boot. "Let them write their stories," Mira said. "We'll keep ours." There were no photos taken that day, no microphones. Just the girl and the dog beneath the trees, quiet amid the snowfall. The only audience, a field of bare pines and the hush of winter returning. And in that stillness, Mira finally smiled. Not the smile for cameras, but the one that begins deep in the chest-bone of something truer than applause. Something like trust. The email arrived on a Wednesday. Plain subject line. Unremarkable sender. But Mira knew the weight before even opening it. K9 Behavioral Readiness Reassessment Invitation. Argon. Classified Ret. She sat at the kitchen table, Argon asleep at her feet, head resting atop one paw like a stone lion at rest. The cursor hovered over the message. She clicked. It was written politely, almost delicately offering Argon a chance to be evaluated for field readiness under new adaptive protocols. A second chance, they called it. Mira didn't forward the email. She didn't reply. Instead, she looked down. Argon's ear twitched at some distant sound, but he didn't stir. He was breathing evenly, eyes closed, caught somewhere between vigilance and peace. 2 hours later, a black car pulled up outside the gate. The agency hadn't waited for a response. A tall man in uniform stepped out, his jacket crisp, boots immaculate. He didn't wear a name tag, just a silver pin in the shape of a German shepherd's head, the emblem of a unit that no longer officially existed. Argon saw him before Mira did. The dog stood, not stiffly, but slowly, as if the scent alone had awakened something old and not entirely welcome. His tail didn't wag. His shoulders tightened, but he stayed beside her. The man offered a practiced smile.
We've been following his progress.
Remarkable recovery, truly. Mira said nothing. We're extending an invitation. Voluntary, of course. He could qualify for non-combat operations. Therapy units, search divisions. It's not about forcing him back, it's about honoring what he still has. She studied the man's face. Well-meaning, maybe, but also blind. He wasn't broken, she said quietly. He doesn't need to be fixed. The officer shifted. Miss, he doesn't belong to you anymore. Argon leaned slightly against her leg, grounding her. Her voice stayed soft, but her spine straightened like steel beneath the flannel shirt. He chose this life, she said, not because of orders, because it's his. The man hesitated, then nodded, not quite understanding, but sensing the finality. He left without another word. The screen door creaked as Mira stepped back inside. Argon followed without needing to be called. His steps matched hers now. Always. She knelt beside him and wrapped her arms around his neck, her face buried in the coarse warmth of his fur. Not again, she whispered. Not this time. That evening, she packed the scarf. It was an old one, wool knit and sun-faded, barely holding its color anymore. Argon had found it months ago, under the porch, dragged it out like treasure and laid on it for days. It had belonged to Mira's mother. She used to wear it during early morning walks in the orchard, or while waiting on the porch swing when Mira missed the bus. Mira hadn't been back to the cemetery since the funeral. She'd avoided the pull of it, the silence. But something in her shifted now. Not grief, not quite. More like a need to tell her mother, he's okay, and so am I. The road was lined with wind-shorn trees, bending slightly under the memory of snow. The cemetery gates were still a little crooked. She remembered her mother used to laugh at that. She parked near the older graves and walked with the scarf tucked under one arm. Argon trotted behind her, ears up but relaxed, tail swaying low. He stopped just short of the headstone, as if sensing the space was sacred. Mira crouched, brushing away a few pine needles from the base. The stone was simple. Her mother had never liked fancy things. She laid the scarf gently across the name. Mom, she murmured, voice barely a breath. You always said love isn't something you train. It's something you grow. She looked sideways at Argon. He's not the dog they wanted him to be. But he's everything I needed. Argon didn't sit. He simply lowered himself beside her, resting his chin on the earth as if it, too, meant something. He listens in ways people don't, she continued, her voice catching. He doesn't perform. He just is. That used to be enough for you. So I think you'd understand why I said no. A quiet wind moved through the trees, soft and unhurried. Mira closed her eyes. For a moment, it felt like hands brushing back her hair the way her mother used to. Not magic, just memory. She stayed there a while longer. No hurry. No need to explain time to someone who'd always understood what it meant to wait, to heal, to choose. As dusk settled over the hills, she stood, brushing the dirt from her knees. Argon rose with her. They walked side by side back toward the truck, neither leading, neither following. And the scarf? She left it there not as an offering, but as a conversation finished. Some goodbyes are gentle, and some, like this one, are not about parting at all. They're about saying, I'm ready. There were no reporters this time, no onlookers behind glass, no words like therapy breakthrough or untrainable hero, just morning light shifting quietly through the canopy, dappling the worn path with gold. Mira stood at the edge of the forest clearing, her hands at her sides. She didn't carry a bag, no phone playing melodies, no treats in her pocket, just Heron the dog beside her. Argon waited, ears flicking at the sound of the wind. The leash lay coiled in her palm, unused. She glanced down at it once, then slowly dropped it. It fell without a sound, landing in soft moss. Let's go, she whispered. Not a command, not even a request. Just a breath shared between two beings who no longer needed words. Argon didn't bolt ahead. He didn't hesitate either. He simply stepped forward, mirroring her pace, as though their feet were bound by the same rhythm. Side by side, they moved into the trees, swallowed by the hush of pine and memory. This was the forest trail where she had first found him, covered in snow. hollow-eyed, hiding behind a barricade of instinct and fear. Back then, she hadn't known what to call the thing that pulsed between thema fragile threads spun from music, grief, and something neither of them could name. She knew now. It was trust. The trail narrowed as they walked deeper. Frost still kissed the undergrowth in the shaded bends, and branches overhead shivered softly, loosing specks of light with every breeze. Argon's steps made no sound on the earth, but Mira could feel him there, every shift of muscle, every alert pause. At one bend, they stopped beside a fallen tree. Mira sat first, brushing bark dust from her palms, and Argon followed, curling beside her. His head nudged her knee. She didn't pet him. She didn't need to. For a long while, they just watched the branches sway. Mira's thoughts drifted not in anxious loops like they used to, but in slow, healing arcs. She thought of the avalanche, of the buried woman and the scream that nearly didn't reach anyone, of Argon, who had dug not because he was told, but because he understood, and of the way he had laid his body across the snow when the cold crept in shielding warmth the way no training ever taught. She thought of the email from the agency. "We believe Argon may now qualify for reinstatement into official search and rescue." She hadn't even opened the attachment. The old Mira might have been tempted. The version of her that still believed value came from performance, that saving something broken meant returning it to what it once was. But Argon had never been broken. He had simply been hurt. And now, beside her in this wordless place, she could feel him whole, not polished, not perfect, but present. A jay called out somewhere above, cutting through the stillness. Argon's ears twitched, then settled again. He leaned against her gently, not for support, but in offering. "I don't want you to be anything but this," she murmured, fingers brushing his fur like turning pages in a book she'd come to love slowly. "No vests, no commands, no audiences." He blinked, eyes half-lidded, content. They rose again without cue. The trail curved toward the ridge, where snow had finally begun to melt into soft rivulets. Mira stepped carefully on slick stones, and Argon mirrored her, not pulling ahead, just walking. At a fork in the path, Mira paused. There, beneath the roots of a gnarled oak, something fluttered half-buried beneath pine needles. She knelt. A strip of weathered cloth. The scarf, the one she used to tie loosely around Argon's neck during his first days at the facility, worn from washings. Faded at the edges, he'd buried it once when a visitor startled him, hit it like something too precious to lose. Now, it had returned to the surface, as if the earth itself had chosen this moment to give it back. Mira picked it up, shaking free the needles. She didn't tie it back on him. She folded it, tucked it gently in her jacket. A keepsake not of failure, but of beginning. The path opened ahead, sunlit and quiet. Argon looked to her. She didn't nod, didn't speak, just stepped forward again. He followed. Their shadows stretched ahead of them, two shapes moving as one. No spotlight, no score, just breath, just footsteps, just a walk. And that was enough. The cabin had grown used to silent sonat, the lonely kind, but the kind that settles after a long journey, like a breath finally exhaled. By mid-November, the wind sang different songs through the eaves. Trees had lost most of their leaves, and the pines stood darker against the frostbitten sky. In the mornings, frost glittered on the porch railing like forgotten sugar. And at night, the world pulled its blanket tighter, as if holding something fragile in its arms. Inside, beneath the patchwork quilt on the narrow bed, Mira stirred. Argon lay on the braided rug beside her. Not in the hallway, not by the hearth right there, just inches away from her outstretched hand. It hadn't started that way. At first, he'd kept his distance, respectful, uncertain. But slowly, as trust filled the air like quiet music, he inched closer. First, to the bedroom door. Then, just inside. Then, one paw on the rug. And now, he stayed. He didn't ask to be invited. He simply knew when she needed him near. That night, the wind picked up around 2 a.m., a low, mournful howl that seeped through the cracks in the logs. A pine cone thudded against the roof. The fire had burned down to an amber hush. Mira's breath turned shallow. Her fingers twitched against the quilt. In the dream, her mother was standing at the foot of the forest, hair braided like she always wore it, eyes the color of the first rain. She didn't speak, just looked back at Mira with that expression, half warning, half welcome. And then the trees caught fire behind her. Mira whimpered softly. Argon's ear twitched first. Then his head rose. She turned in her sleep, curled tighter, her shoulders trembling. Her breath caught, and a choked sound slipped from her lip shaft word, half-ache. "Mama." Argon stood. He didn't make a sound, didn't whine or paw the bed. He simply stepped closer, his claws silent on the wood. The air shifted with him. He rested his chin on the edge of the mattress, eyes trained on her like a sentry. Watching, waiting. Then, gently, so gently it might have been mistaken for Wendy, pressed his head onto her chest. She startled at first. Her hand flew up instinctively, fingers brushing against fur. She didn't open her eyes, but her breathing slowed. There was something in the weight of him, the stillness of 80 pounds of quiet devotion that pulled her back. Not jarringly, not the way alarms do, but like memory, like safety, like the arms of someone who never asked you to be okay but stayed anyway. Her hand found the top of his head and stayed there. A minute passed, then another. Her fingers, once rigid, softened. Her tears slipped silently across her cheeks and landed in his fur. Argon didn't move. The wind howled again outside. Somewhere far off, a branch cracked under the weight of frost. But in that small cabin, a girl and a dog lay still, one resting, the other watching. He didn't need commands anymore. There was no reward here, no training manual, just instinct, something older than obedience, something woven through his bones like marrow. He had once been called a failure, too reactive, too sensitive, unfit. But he was exactly what Mira needed. She didn't wake fully until the sun began to edge its way through the linen curtains. A faint gold line cut across the wall, warming the grain of the wood. Argon was still there, his head now nestled closer to her ribs, his body curled beside the bed in a half-moon of quiet loyalty. Her eyes opened slowly. For a moment, she said nothing, just stared at the ceiling and listened to the rhythm of two beings breathing hers and his. Then she turned toward him, her hand sliding down to rest gently on his neck. "You stayed," she whispered. His tail thumped once against the rug. She let out a quiet breath. Not quite a sigh, not quite a cry. Just something between theme and exhale that said thank you, without needing the words. The light in the room grew, chasing away shadows. The fire, now only coals, still radiated a dull warmth. Outside, the forest waited. But inside, in that small room tucked between sky and earth, trust had taken root in the hush of night. And in that quiet space between the pain of memory and the promise of morning, he had become more than a dog beside a bed. He had become her keeper, her night watch, her home. The concert hall wasn't grand. It smelled faintly of wood polish and candle wax, with walls lined in warm cedar that caught and cradled sound. The town had offered the venue for free once the word got out about Mira's cause, a sanctuary for the misunderstood, the unwanted, the almost forgotten. Outside, the mountain air folded into the dusk like a hush before snowfall. Inside, the seats filled slowly with neighbors, hikers, rangers, parents holding children tight to their chests. A man from the shelter who once said Argon should be put down now sat in the third row, wearing his guilt in the silence between breaths. The stage was simple, just a stool, a single overhead light, and Mira's cello propped carefully in the center. At the edge, Argon sat. No leash, no handler, no command, just him, sitting there like he'd always belonged to the silence. The house lights dimmed, and for a heartbeat, nothing. Then a soft cough, then stillness again. Then Mira stepped into view, her steps steady but slow. She didn't wear black like a formal soloist. Instead, a pale wool sweater hung gently over her shoulders, and her mother's scarf, Argon swaths, wrapped around her wrist like a promise. She looked out at the room, scanning briefly until her eyes landed on him. Argon, ears forward, still as stone, watching only her. Mira nodded once, then lowered herself onto the stool. Her fingers trembled slightly, not with nerves, but memory. She drew the cello between her knees, let her bow hover above the strings like a breath held long, and then began. The first note wasn't strong. It was shy, as though the melody itself had been waiting years to be allowed back into the room. It grew, each note layered on the next, some sweet and round like spring rain, others sharp like the crack of breaking ice. The music wove through the rafters and curled through the ribs of everyone in the room, warming grief, softening pride, untying all the knots we don't know we carry. And all the while, Argon didn't move, not an inch. He sat beside her like a sentinel of silent sealert, calm, sacred. A dog who once trembled at any human sound, now sitting before hundreds, needing no command, not even a look. Because he knew this was Mira's voice now, and he was there to guard it. Halfway through the performance, a small child began to cry, frightened, maybe, or overwhelmed by the emotion vibrating in the air. Mira faltered, just slightly, and Argon turned. Not to bark, not to leave, just to glance, soft and slow, in the direction of the child. His head tilted, ears relaxed. A gesture that wasn't trained, it was chosen. The child stopped crying. It was like the air had reset itself. Mira exhaled and kept playing. She played the song her mother used to hum while cooking, the one that ended in an unfinished phrase. She played the melody Argon had heard on that cold morning during the avalanche. And then she played something new, something she'd written after that night, when his head pressed into her chest like an anchor holding her to this world. When the last note lifted and fell like the last leaf of autumn, Mira let her bow fall to her side. She didn't bow. She didn't speak. She just reached out and placed her hand lightly on Argon's back. And he leaned into it. The applause didn't come in a burst. It came slowly, like people didn't want to break what had just been made in the room. A few claps, then more, then a standing ovation that felt less like celebration and more like gratitude. Not just for the music, but for the silence that made it possible. Afterward, people came forward, not to speak, but to leave small envelopes in the donation jar-folded bills, notes scrawled with trembling hands. One woman gave Mira a photograph of her own rescue dog, long since passed. Another simply whispered, "Thank you for giving him a voice." But Argon didn't seem interested in the attention. As the crowd dispersed, he stood, stretched gently, and walked to the edge of the stage where Mira now sat cross-legged, hands around a mug of cooling tea. He rested his chin on her knee, and for a long time, neither of them moved, just breathing, just being. Outside, it had begun to snow soft, slow, like the world had decided to give them this moment in white silence. The same silence that once haunted Argon, that once made Mira feel alone. Now, it wrapped around them like a lullaby. The stage was still. Warm lights cast long shadows over the polished wood floor, softened by the golden hue of evening spilling through stained glass. The air inside the old community hall carried the hush of reverence, like a chapel without prayers, just breath, just presence. Mira stood beside her cello, bow in hand. Her black dress, simple and unadorned, moved slightly with her chest's rise and fall. She didn't look at the audience. Not yet. Her gaze settled on the floor in front of her, where Argon lay curled, not restrained, not commanded, just there, silent. His coat shimmered under the soft lights, and his ears twitched once, catching her breath. Then, stillness again. The first half of the concert had gone as planned pieces chosen to raise funds for the sanctuary, melodies that spoke of quiet courage and restoration. People came not because they were patrons of the arts, but because they had read the story. Untrainable dog finds his place beside music. It was no longer a headline, it was a movement, a symbol. A boy with a stutter had pressed his crumpled drawing of Argon into Mira's hand earlier that evening, whispering, "He listens." Now, Mira sat, cello between her knees. She didn't speak. There was no need. The final piece was one she hadn't played in years, not in public. Not since the last hospital room echo where her mother's hands were too weak to hold the bow, so Mira had played for her, trembling. It was her mother's melody, not one written down, not one that could be notated or recorded, just remembered. She pressed the strings softly with her fingers, and the first note hovered in the air like breath on cold glass. It wavered, then held. A delicate tremor, Argon shifted, not toward the crowd, toward her. As the melody unfolded, gentle and spiraling like wind over wheat slowly uncurled, his paws stretched forward. His head rose, ears neither alert nor tense, just listening. Mira's eyes closed. The bow sang across the strings, coaxing out something older than grief and more fragile than hope. There were no crescendos, no flair, just aching simplicity. 3 rows back, an elderly woman clasped her hands and closed her eyes. A boy with a cochlear implant tapped a quiet rhythm on his mother's sleeve. A soldier in uniform wiped his eyes. On the stage, Argon inched closer to Mira, not seeking permission, not responding to any gesture, simply moving with the music, with her. She opened her eyes as the final passage came near. The notes slowed less sound now, more silence between vibrations. Her fingers trembled. The cello resonated with something that wasn't volume, but memory. Each note landing like a breath once held, now released. And then just before the last note, Argon laid his head gently on her foot. The gesture was so unassuming, so weightless, that Mira nearly missed it. But it was everything. Her bow paused in the air. The moment hovered no applause, no movement from the audience. Even the lights seemed to hold their breath. She drew the final note. It wasn't loud. It wasn't long. It simply was. As it faded, Argon closed his eyes. And in that stillness, something profound passed between them. Not obedience, not training, not the shallow mimicry of performance, but presence. Complete, trusting, undeniably real. The hall remained silent. No one clapped, not out of confusion, but out of respect, as if they knew, instinctively, that something sacred had just happened, and to speak would be to shatter it. Mira didn't bow. She didn't stand. She placed her bow gently across the strings and reached down with one hand to rest it on Argon's head. He didn't flinch, didn't move, just stayed. A minute passed, then 2, a sniffle from the back row. Then, softly, someone whispered, "Thank you." Others followed not in chorus, but in quiet acknowledgments. A woman placed her hand over her heart. A man whispered something to the child beside him and wiped their cheek with his sleeve. And then, the applause came. Not explosive, not showy. A wave of warmth, of shared breath and release. The kind of clapping that meant, "We saw you, we felt this. Thank you for not rushing the silence." Mira stood slowly, not smiling, but softened. Argon rose with her. His tail gave a single lazy wagnet for them, not even for the room, just because. She looked down at him. No leash, no vest, no commands. Just Argon, and whispered, barely audible over the applause, "You played too." He blinked, slowly. Together they stepped off the stage. The sky hung low over the sanctuary that morning, swollen with the stillness that comes before a storm but never quite breaks into one. Dew clung to the fence posts like tiny breaths that hadn't yet exhaled. The wind was barely more than a thought, brushing gently through the tall grass as if it too were waiting. A delivery van rumbled up the gravel path, tires cracking the quiet like brittle promises. From the porch, Mira watched without standing. Argon lay beside her, ears perked, not in alarm but awareness. Some instinct never dulled. The driver climbed out, clipboard in hand, and motioned toward the crate in the back. "He's all yours," he said, not unkindly. "Shelters gave up. 3 bites. They said he doesn't respond to anything." Mira nodded. She had heard those words before, had lived in the echo of them. The crate door opened, and for a long moment, nothing moved. Then a flash of mottled brown raw eyes scanning the open space like a prisoner stepping into false freedom. His ribs showed beneath a pelt that looked both unwashed and unloved. The dog didn't bark, didn't lunge. He simply stood at the edge of his crate, weight shifting from paw to paw, unsure if the world outside was any better than the cage. Name? Mira asked quietly. The driver shrugged. Some called him Rust, others just called him Number. Her heart cracked, not dramatically, but in that quiet, irrevocable way that comes from hearing a soul summed up by rejection. She didn't call out to him, didn't offer treats or commands. She simply walked a few steps forward, her boots sinking slightly into the softened ground. Then she turned and walked back toward the barn. She left the door open. Inside, light filtered through the old windows like faded music. Dust swirled in the air, settling on the strings of her cello where it rested against a wooden chair. Mira sat slowly, the way one lowers into memory. Argon entered first, his gait steady, shoulders relaxed. He didn't glance back, didn't need to. Trust doesn't require permission. Mira drew the bow across the strings. No warm-up, no scale, just the long, aching tone of a G. It filled the barn like breath, returning to lungs. Then, another note. Then, silence again. She wasn't performing. She was simply being. Outside, the newcomer lingered in the threshold. One paw forward, then retreat, then forward again. It was not obedience. It was curiosity's quiet rebellion against fear. Mira didn't turn. Her music spoke softer than any voice could. She played what her mother once played when sadness sat two close melodies without names, built from pauses and memory. The dog entered. Step by slow step. Argon remained still, his eyes half-lidded, as if he'd known all along this was how it had to be. The bow moved again. A phrase, a rest. The notes didn't call the dog forward. They simply gave him room. Mira felt the air shift before she saw him. The new dog Rust, or whatever name time, would later Grant was sitting across from her, just far enough for escape, close enough for possibility. His ears twitched with each vibration of string. His tail didn't wag, but it also didn't tuck. No one spoke. No one needed to. Hours passed that way music, silence, the gentle creak of the barn beams like old bones remembering how to bend. Outside, the sky let go of its storm and drizzle. Not a downpour, just a letting down of burdens. The staff came and went. Some peeked in, expecting Mira to be issuing commands, luring the new dog with treats or discipline. But she simply sat, played, listened. One of them, a young girl named Janu, whispered to the head vet, "Is she going to start training him?" The older woman, wise from years of watching miracles that didn't look like them at first, replied, "She already is." Mira kept playing long after her fingers numbed, long after the sun dipped behind the trees and the lights flicked on automatically. Eventually, the dog stood, approached, not in surrender, but something closer to recognition. He didn't sit beside her. He didn't place his head on her lap. He simply lay down close but not touching, as if saying, "I'm not ready for love, but I'm tired of running from it." Mira lowered her bow, exhaled, her fingers stilled on the string, but her heart did not. Argon shifted slightly, eyes meeting hers in that silent way he had. Not approval, not pride, just agreement. Outside, the rain had stopped. The last drops clung to the windows like small, unfinished prayers. Inside, a new beginning had already started, not through force, not through reward, through presence, through patience, through a cello's voice saying simply, "You're allowed to stay." The afternoon light spilled lazily through the sanctuary's windows, painting golden streaks across the floor. Dust swirled gently in the stillness, dancing like memories too soft to disturb. Mira stood by the old wooden railing outside the kennel yard, one hand cradling the warm ceramic of her tea mug, the other resting on her chest, where her heartbeat felt oddly steady today. Below her, a lean, mud-splattered pup paced in erratic loops. A young Dutch shepherd, sharp angles beneath ragged fur, eyes wide with a wildness that hadn't yet decided if it was fear or fury. They'd named him Koa, after a tree known to survive storms and lava. He hadn't let anyone close yet. Not the handlers, not the volunteers, not even food had coaxed him near. But Argon was there. The old German shepherd sat at a distance, just far enough not to threaten, just close enough to be seen. His posture was relaxed, regal in the way only time and quiet understanding could teach. His ears were half forward, eyes lowered but watching. Occasionally, his tail made a soft sweep against the earth, Not in greeting, but in reassurance. It had been 2 days. 2 days of nothing spoken, nothing forced. And Mira, now older in spirit than the mirror gave credit for, had learned that silence could be the most generous language, especially for souls that arrived already bruised by noise. She remembered the first time Argon had looked at her with trust, not because she commanded it, but because she'd stopped commanding altogether. Trust had been a song they wrote in silence. Koa stopped suddenly in his pacing, his body frozen mid-turn, as if a thought had interrupted him from within. He glanced at Argon. Not long, not even directly, just a flicker. Then resumed pacing. Mira didn't move, didn't speak. She simply sat down beside her cello case in the shade, careful not to break the fragile fabric of the moment. Argon didn't move either, and that, she thought, was the beginning of teaching. That night, Mira lay awake longer than usual. The moonlight filtered through the lace curtains, tracing gentle veins of silver across her walls. At her side, Argon slept deeply, his chest rising in slow, deliberate rhythm. She reached out and rested her hand on his back. "You're teaching him, aren't you?" she whispered. Argon stirred only slightly, pressing into her palm. No need for words, no need for stories. He was passing on something older than language presence. She closed her eyes and let her breath match his. The next morning, Mira returned to the enclosure early, cello in hand, the dew still clinging to the grass. She didn't bring treats. She didn't bring clickers or leashes. Only the instrument. Only the quiet. Koa was awake, eyes fixed on her from the far corner, ears twitching. He hadn't come closer, but he hadn't growled this time either. Argon trotted beside her, unhurried, as if this were merely a walk, not a lesson. He settled in the dirt where he'd been before his spot. Mira opened her case and drew the bow across the strings. Once. The note hung in the air like a question asked centuries ago. She began with a slow, familiar tune. Not quite her mother's melody, something simpler, earthbound. Notes that felt like sunlight warming skin, or the hush before snowfall. Argon blinked, his breathing steady. Koa stiffened, his head lifting slightly. She didn't watch him. She just played. No crescendos, no dramatics. Only tone and trust. After a while, Koa lowered his body. Forelegs folded. Tail flat but no longer tucked. His eyes flicked to Argon, then to the cello, then closed for a heartbeat too long to be mere blinking. Mira's throat caught. She didn't stop playing. By the third day, Koa didn't pace anymore. He didn't come closer either, but he lay curled in the corner, watching. Sometimes his ears would perk at a certain note. Sometimes he would stretch his legs, paws twitching in sleep. Argon never moved closer, never engaged. He simply was, steady, still, safe. The volunteers began to notice. "You think Argon knows what he's doing?" someone whispered. Mira didn't answer. She remembered something her mother had once said, not in a lesson, not in a lecture, just in passing, over tea and rain tapping on the window. Trust doesn't begin with understanding. It begins with letting something be. Argon was letting Koa be. Frightened, angry, guarded, but not alone. And that made all the difference. A week later, it happened. Mira was tuning the cello, bow across her lap, eyes closed, when she heard the softest sound like a shuffle of paws on gravel. When she looked up, Koa was no longer in the corner. He was 10 steps closer, still, low to the ground. But there, Argon remained in place, only his eyes shifting toward the pup. Koa's gaze darted between them. Then, as if responding to an invisible thread, he lay down closer now, still tense, still ready to flee. But something had shifted. Presence had been enough. Argon let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. His tail swept the ground once. Just once. Mira didn't speak. She didn't dare. But inside her chest, something bloomed wide and warm. Argon hadn't needed to retrain, reform, or rescue. He had only needed to be there. And in doing so, he had become the sanctuary's most profound teacher. Not of obedience, but of grace. The wind was gentle that morning, the kind that whispered instead of howled. It bent the long grass just enough to shimmer in waves across the hillside. Overhead, Soft clouds drifted like unspoken thoughts. The sanctuary had no fences, no alarms, just space and breath, and the quiet presence of lives slowly remembering how to be whole. Mira stood in the middle of it, all sunlight, catching in the strands of her loose braid, the hem of her shirt smudged with paint. In her hands was a weathered wooden plank, repurposed from the old horse stable. The grain of the wood had aged like skin, knotted, cracked, and beautiful in its imperfection. Her fingers, now streaked in drying white, traced over the words she had just finished painting. Trust begins in the quiet. Each letter had been brushed with care, not precision. The strokes weren't professional. They were honest, raw, and real. She stepped back, her boots pressing soft dents into the earth, and looked at what she'd made. For the first time in years, she didn't second-guess herself. Claire would have understood, would have smiled that quiet smile of hers, the one that didn't need approval because it was never about being right. It was about being present. From the far side of the field, Argon walked toward her. Not ran, walked. There was no urgency in his gait anymore, just awareness, confidence. His steps were slow, deliberate shoulders swaying in rhythm with the breeze. He paused beside her, his tail giving a soft, single wag as if to say, "This is good." And it was. Behind them, dogs dotted the open land like wildflowers. Some still wore their histories and their posture crouched low, eyes scanning for ghosts. Others had begun to stretch, to explore, to rest. A three-legged retriever rolled in a patch of dandelions like he was trying to scratch, something only memory could reach. A once feral mutt sat at the base of a tree, staring up as if just now discovering leaves. There were no commands, no drills, no whistles, just healing. It came slowly here, on its own terms. Sometimes it looked like a nap in the sun, sometimes like a dog approaching the porch for the first time, and sometimes it looked like Mira, standing beside her once untrainable partner, holding a sign that wasn't meant to direct but to remind. Trust wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned, or better yet offered. She remembered Claire's voice. Years ago, sitting in the dark of a storm with a shaking pup in her lap. You don't fix them by teaching them tricks, Mira. You just sit there. Let them fall apart next to you. And when they're ready, you're still there. That's trust. That's the beginning. Back then, Mira hadn't understood. Not really. She'd wanted to save them, to do something. Now, she knew better. Healing didn't need noise. It needed space. It needed quiet and time. A soft bark pulled her attention to the left. The new dog, still unnamed, still wary, had crept from the shadow of the barn. He didn't approach Mira, didn't come bounding with tail wags, but he looked at Argon, watched him, measured the way the old German shepherd sat calm and open, a teacher without words. Argon didn't move, didn't stir. He simply existed, grounded, unshaken, present. And somehow, that was enough. The pup inched forward, then paused. Mira didn't speak. She didn't encourage. Just let the moment unfold. This was no performance, no progress report. It was trust, beginning again. She turned toward the porch and placed the sign by the gate, not too high, not framed, just there, so that anyone walking in wouldn't be told what to expect, but reminded of how things worked here. No pressure, no timeline, just quiet, just presence. Good, she whispered almost to herself. Argon's ear twitched. He heard everything, always had. He rose slowly and pressed his shoulder into her hip, a grounding weight. She didn't need his obedience. She needed his being. In the silence that followed, Mira sat on the porch steps, knees pulled to her chest. Argon laid beside her with a soft huff of air. And for a long while, they watched the field, watched a chorus of second chances unfold. A senior husky licked the face of a dog who hadn't been touched in weeks. A black lab who once tore through chain-link fences now played with a worn rubber Ballonly, occasionally glancing to see if someone would take it away. The sun moved inch by inch across the sky. And nothing hurt. Not right now. Mira reached behind her and pulled her cello from its case. The wood was warm from the morning light. She didn't use a music stand, didn't tune, just closed her eyes and let her fingers find the notes the way Claire had taught her not to impress, but to remember. The melody was simple, the same one she'd played during the final concert, the one Argon had closed his eyes to long after the applause had faded. It drifted now across the field like a lullaby. A dog barked once, then stopped. Another lay down. And then, like clockwork, Argon leaned against her thigh and let out a soft, scythe kind only a creature who had seen too much and finally felt safe could make. The music lingered in the air, not begging to be heard, just there. And that was enough, because here, in this quiet sanctuary of bruised hearts and wagging tails, healing was not a destination, it was a rhythm, and every note began the same way, with trust and silence. Sometimes, it's not the words we say, but the quiet moments we share that remind us what love really means. A loyal gaze, a soft paw on your knee, a steady breath beside you when sleep won't come. German shepherds like Argon don't ask for much, but what they give in return is everything. Loyalty without condition, presence without judgment, and healing that asks nothing but time. If this story stirred something in you, maybe a memory, maybe a longing, you're not alone. Our bond with animals isn't just companionship. It's something older, quieter, something that reminds us to trust again. If you're looking to deepen that bond with your own dog, there are gentle resources out there, not training manuals, but spaces of understanding. I recently came across something that touched me deeply. If you're curious, I'd be happy to share it. Just reach out when it feels right. Until then, give your dog an extra scratch behind the ear tonight. Sit a little longer. Listen without speaking. Sometimes, trust begins right there, in the quiet.